For 51 years, a single sheet of paper sat at the center of one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history, and nobody could read it. 340 characters, handwritten in neat rows. Sent to a San Francisco newspaper in November 1969 by a man who had already killed and who wanted the world to know he was cleverer than the people hunting him. The FBI worked on it. The NSA worked on it. Codebreakers who had cracked wartime systems worked on it. Thousands of amateurs worked on it for decades, filling forums and notebooks and entire lifetimes with attempted solutions. And it did not break. Then, in December 2020, it broke in a single afternoon. Not by an agency, by three men who had never met in person. A web developer in Virginia, a mathematician in Australia, and a warehouse worker in Belgium who wrote code-breaking software as a hobby. This is the story of how they did it, and it is worth saying at the outset what this video is not. It is not a video about who the Zodiac was, because that is not known. It is not a video that will show you crime scenes or victims. The people he killed were young, and they were real, and they have families who are still alive. This is a story about a puzzle, the people who would not put it down, and the strange, mundane, brilliant reason it had resisted for half a century. Start with what the ciphers were and why they existed at all. In the summer of 1969, a series of attacks in Northern California were linked by the man who committed them to a set of letters sent to newspapers. He wrote to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. He gave himself a name, and he attached puzzles. That combination is unusual, and it matters. Many people who commit these crimes avoid attention entirely. This one demanded it, and made the newspapers his channel. He threatened them, print this or more people die. It is worth setting out the shape of the case briefly, without dwelling on it, because it explains the pressure the codebreakers were working under. The attacks attributed to him took place in Northern California, in and around Vallejo, Napa County, and San Francisco, between December 1968 and October 1969. 5 murders are generally accepted as his. 2 people survived attacks and were able to describe what happened. He later claimed a far higher number in his letters, and there is no evidence supporting those claims. The victims were young, most were students or in their early 20s. Their names are a matter of public record, and their families are still living, and this video is going to leave the details of what happened to them alone. It is not necessary to the story of the cipher, and it is not ours to display. What matters here is the effect. Because the letters were printed, the papers judged reasonably that the threat left them little choice. The case became public property in a way that very few investigations ever do. Ordinary readers were handed the puzzles directly over breakfast and invited to try. That decision, made under duress in 1969, is the reason an army of amateurs existed at all. It created a case that the public felt entitled to work on, and that feeling never went away. There is one more thing about the newspapers worth knowing. He wrote to them repeatedly over the following years, and not every letter was accepted as genuine. Handwriting was compared, phrasing was examined, and some letters claiming to be from him were judged to be hoaxes. Others are still argued about. So even the raw material of the case comes with a layer of uncertainty over which documents actually belong in it. The ciphers, though, are not in doubt. The 408 and the 340 are accepted as his. The first cipher arrived in 3 parts, 1 to each paper, in early August 1969. 408 characters in total, split into 3 sections of roughly 136. It is known as the 408, and it lasted about a week. The people who solved it were not cryptographers. Donald Harden was a high school teacher in Salinas, California. His wife Betty was a homemaker. They worked on it over a weekend at their kitchen table, and they broke it. How they did it is a lesson in how these puzzles actually fall. The 408 was a substitution cipher, each symbol standing for a letter. But it was a particular kind called a homophonic substitution, where common letters get several different symbols each. The letter E might be represented by 7 different characters. That defeats the most basic attack on a substitution cipher, which is counting how often each symbol appears and matching the frequencies to English. It is worth being concrete about how that works, because the same principle governs everything that follows. In ordinary English, the letter E accounts for roughly 12% of all letters. T is about 9. A handful of letters do most of the work, and a long tail barely appear at all. So if you take a simple substitution cipher, one symbol per letter, and count how often each symbol occurs, the most common symbol is almost certainly E, the next most likely T, and you are already most of the way in. Homophonic substitution destroys that. If E is allowed 7 different symbols, then each of those 7 appears roughly 1/7 as often, which is about the same frequency as a moderately common letter. Flatten the distribution enough, and the counting attack tells you nothing at all, because every symbol looks equally ordinary. The 408 used around 50 distinct symbols to represent 26 letters, with the commonest letters given several each. That is enough to make frequency counting useless. What it does not defeat is a guess about content. So the Hardens did something cleverer. Betty Harden guessed at content. She reasoned that a man this determined to be noticed would begin by talking about himself, and that the word most likely to appear was I. And that a man boasting about killing would probably use the word kill, and quite possibly the phrase I like killing. They tried it, it fitted, and from that foothold the rest unraveled over the weekend. The decoded message was a rambling statement about killing being more enjoyable than hunting, and about victims becoming slaves in an afterlife. The spelling was poor throughout, words like paradise for paradise, experience for experience, and those misspellings will matter later. And there was one more thing. The last 18 characters of the 408 did not decode into anything. They appeared to be filler, or a deliberate tease, or possibly a name that was scrambled beyond recovery. Nobody has ever agreed. Those 18 characters have generated an enormous amount of speculation over the years. Some believe they are a name, enciphered under a different scheme. Some believe they are deliberate filler, added to pad the message to a length divisible into 3 equal parts for the 3 newspapers, which is a mundane explanation and, for that reason, quite a persuasive one. Some believe the writer simply made mistakes at the end and did not care. There is no way to decide between those, and this video is not going to pretend otherwise. 18 characters is far too little material to test any theory against. Hold on to that idea that a short message cannot be solved even in principle, because it returns at the end and it explains what will never be known about this case. So, the first cipher fell in a week, to a schoolteacher and his wife working at their kitchen table, which set an expectation for the second one that turned out to be badly wrong. The 340-character cipher, the 340, arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle on the 8th of November, 1969. Same style, handwritten symbols, a mixture of letters, Greek characters, shapes, and invented marks. 17 rows of 20 characters each. Everyone assumed it would go the same way as the first. It was only slightly shorter. It looked like the same kind of thing. The Hardens' method was known. Surely it was a matter of weeks. It took 51 years and 1 month. To understand why, you need to understand what the codebreakers were actually up against. And the honest answer is that for decades they were solving the wrong problem. Everyone assumed the 340 was another homophonic substitution like the 408. Harder, maybe, more symbols. But the same fundamental shape. Symbol stands for letter, read left to right, top to bottom. And under that assumption, it is not merely difficult, it is impossible, because it was never that. And there was a second problem, which is that the field filled up with noise. Over 5 decades, a great many people announced that they had solved the 340. Solutions were published in books, mailed to police departments, posted on forums, and presented on television. Almost all of them decoded into a name, usually the name of whichever suspect the solver already favored. They shared a common flaw, and it is worth naming because it applies well beyond this case. If you allow yourself enough freedom, if symbols can mean different things in different places, if you may skip characters that do not fit, if you may read in whatever direction produces a word, then you can extract almost any message from almost any text. The method is unfalsifiable. It always succeeds, which is precisely what makes it worthless. The test of a real solution is the opposite. It must be produced by a rule stated in advance, applied consistently to every character, with no exceptions permitted for convenience. And it must generate readable English for the whole message, not a few flattering fragments. That is the standard the eventual solution met, and essentially none of the earlier claims did. It is also why the FBI's confirmation mattered, not because an agency blessed it, but because the rule could be handed to anyone else and reproduced exactly. There were clues that something was different, and people noticed them early. Statistical tests on the 340 behaved oddly. The distribution of symbols did not look like normal English written in a substitution cipher. Something about the structure was wrong in a way nobody could name. One measurement in particular kept nagging. If you take the message and compare it against itself, shifted along by a certain number of positions, and count how often characters match, you can detect underlying regularity. When researchers did this to the 340, they found an unusual spike, a periodicity at 19. That number was a genuine clue, sitting in plain sight for decades, and its meaning only became clear at the end. It is worth explaining why a measurement like that is meaningful at all, because it is the closest thing the codebreakers had to a compass. Written English is not random. Certain letters follow certain others constantly. T is followed by H far more often than chance allows. Q is followed by U almost always. Even after you replace every letter with a symbol, those relationships survive. They are hidden, but they are still in the arrangement. So when a message has been scrambled by rearrangement rather than substitution, traces of the original adjacencies remain, displaced by however far the scrambling moved them. Measure how strongly a text agrees with a shifted copy of itself, and any regular displacement shows up as a spike at that distance. The 340 spiked at 19. That was the pattern shouting that something structural had been done to the order of the characters, not merely that letters had been swapped for symbols. The reason nobody could act on it is that a spike tells you a displacement exists. It does not tell you what produced it. Many different rearrangements could generate a 19. Working backwards from the number to the scheme is not possible. You have to guess the scheme and check whether the number falls out, which is exactly what the eventual search did. And when the right scheme was tried, the 19 was explained. The 340 also did not arrive in isolation, and the other material around it shaped how people read it. Over the following months and years, more letters came. One enclosed a piece of a blood-stained shirt to prove the writer was who he claimed. One was a greetings card sent around Halloween. One contained a diagram of a bomb he said he intended to use on a school bus, with a description of how it would be triggered. Several contained the crossed circle symbol he used as a signature. There were also 2 further ciphers, both very short, and we will come back to those. And there was one letter that promised the thing everyone wanted. It stated, in effect, that his name was contained in a cipher, the 13-character one. That single claim is responsible for a great deal of the effort spent on this case over 50 years, and for a great deal of the false solutions, because it told thousands of people that a name was sitting there waiting to be extracted. Then there is the television broadcast, which matters because the 340's eventual solution refers to it. In October 1969, a San Francisco morning program hosted by Jim Dunbar took calls from a man identifying himself as the Zodiac. He spoke on air, said he had headaches, and said he wanted to talk to a lawyer. A well-known attorney, Melvin Belly, was brought in to speak with him. The caller gave his name as Sam. It was broadcast live, it was sensational, and it was widely assumed at the time to be genuine. The decoded 340 says it was not him. That is a small thing, but it is a useful one because it demonstrates that the message contains information nobody could have planted afterwards. A false solution produced in 2020 would be unlikely to generate a specific, checkable denial about a broadcast from October 1969. Now let us bring in the man who would eventually organize the solution. David Orenchak is a software developer from Virginia. He started working on the Zodiac ciphers around 2006, essentially as a programming hobby, an interesting problem to point code at. He did what a lot of people did, wrote solvers, ran them, got nothing. It is worth being specific about what 14 years of getting nothing actually looks like, because the word hobby undersells it considerably. He tested the obvious assumption, that it was another homophonic substitution like the first cipher, from every direction, and established that under that assumption no solution exists. That is a real result, and a thankless one. Proving that a door is locked earns nobody any credit. He tried reading the grid backwards and in columns and in bustrophodon, alternating direction on each line the way an ox turns at the end of a furrow. He tried treating parts of the message as separate ciphers. He tried assuming the writer had made errors and allowing the solver to tolerate them. He ran solvers against known good test ciphers he built himself, with the same statistical fingerprint as the 340, to check that his tools would recognize a solution if one were there. They would, so the tools were fine and the message still did not yield. And he examined the odd features, the spike at 19, the strange symbol distributions, a handful of characters that appeared exactly once, without being able to say what any of them meant. 14 years of that is not a hobby in the ordinary sense. It is closer to a discipline. But he did two things that most people did not. First, he stayed. 14 years on and off on the same puzzle. Second, he documented it publicly. He built a website and later a YouTube channel where he explained the problem, published his tools and, crucially, showed what did not work and why. That last part is the one people underestimate. Failed attempts are usually invisible. Everyone who tries a famous puzzle tries the obvious things, fails silently and gives up, so the next person tries the same obvious things. By publishing his failures, Oranchak stopped others repeating them and slowly built a public map of the territory that had already been searched. That map is what let the final solution happen quickly once the right idea appeared. Now the second man. Sam Blake is an applied mathematician in Australia. He came to the problem with a specific question, and it was the right one. If the 340 is not read straight through, how might it be read? The technical term is transposition. In a transposition cipher, the letters are not replaced, they are rearranged. You can combine the two, substitute symbols for letters, then scramble the order. Solve only one layer and you get nothing intelligible, so every conventional attack fails, and fails silently. The question was, which rearrangement? There are astronomically many ways to reorder 340 characters. Searching them all is not possible. Searching a sensible subset is. So Blake generated a very large set of plausible reading schemes. Diagonal patterns, columnar roots, various step sizes and directions. The kinds of arrangement a person could actually construct and reverse by hand with pencil and paper in 1969. Around 650,000 of them. For each scheme, the message was rearranged, and the result handed to a solver to see whether anything readable emerged. Which brings in the third man and the tool. Jarl van Eyck is Belgian. He worked in a warehouse, and in his own time he wrote a piece of code-breaking software called As Decrypt, a solver for homophonic substitution ciphers, refined over years and very good at its job. It was As Decrypt that would test each of Blake's rearrangements. So the pieces were in place, Blake's candidate reading schemes, Van Eyck's solver, and Oranchak coordinating and running the search. And in December 2020, it produced something. One of the candidate schemes returned a partial result. Not gibberish, but fragments of English. Real words in a row. The phrase that came back first was, "Hope you are trying to catch me." Oranchak has described the moment of seeing that on screen, after 14 years, and the reasonable reaction is disbelief. Partial hits happen, statistics throw up accidents. You do not trust the first fragment. But it held, and with that foothold, the rest of the scheme resolved. The verification was the careful part, and it deserves more attention than the moment of discovery usually gets. A partial hit is not a solution. The first fragment could have been coincidence. Run enough transformations against enough text and readable strings will surface by luck. So before anyone said anything publicly, the scheme had to explain the whole message, not the interesting bit. It did. Applied consistently, with no special pleading and no skipped characters, the same rule produced continuous readable English across all 340 characters. Then came the checks that made it certain. The writer's misspellings reappeared, the same errors in the same idiosyncratic style as the cipher solved 51 years earlier by two strangers who had no connection to this one. The message referred to a specific broadcast from October 1969, and the structural oddity that had puzzled analysts for decades, the spike at 19, fell out of the scheme as a natural consequence rather than needing to be explained away. 4 independent things all pointing the same way. At that point, it is not a theory. They took it to the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, which confirmed it. The announcement followed in December 2020. And then, characteristically, they published the method, the code, the search, the reasoning, so that anybody could repeat it. That is the difference between a claim and a result. Here is what the Zodiac had actually done, and it is worth going through carefully because the elegance of it is the reason it lasted so long. He wrote his message. He substituted symbols for letters, homophonically, as before. Then he took that string of symbols and laid it into the grid, not in rows, but along diagonals, moving down and to the right, wrapping around in a repeating pattern. And he did it in 3 separate sections. The grid was split into blocks, and each block was filled by that diagonal route independently. That is the whole trick. It is not mathematically sophisticated. Any determined person with a pencil, some squared paper and patience could construct it, and could reverse it, which he needed to be able to do. But it was enough, because every automated attack assumed reading order, and this broke reading order in a way that was regular enough to be reversible and irregular enough not to be guessed. And remember that odd periodicity at 19 that had puzzled people for decades? That was a mathematical shadow cast by the diagonal fill pattern. The clue had been visible the whole time. Nobody could interpret it, because interpreting it required already knowing the answer. So what did the message say? It began, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me." Fan spelled F-A-N. The same poor spelling as the first cipher, and one of the reasons the solution is trusted, because a false solution would not reproduce the writer's specific errors. It went on to say that he was not afraid of the gas chamber because it would send him to paradise all the sooner. Spelled again paradise, exactly as in the 408. And it included a line dismissing a television program. There had been a broadcast in which a caller claiming to be the Zodiac spoke on air. The message denies that this was him. Then it repeated the claim from the first cipher about victims serving him in an afterlife. That is the message, roughly 2 sentences of taunting, a denial about a TV appearance, and a restatement of a belief he had already stated. Sit with the disappointment of that for a moment, because it is part of the story. 51 years, thousands of people, agencies with supercomputers, careers spent. And the answer was a short, badly spelled boast, containing no name, no location, no confession to anything not already claimed, and no information of any investigative value whatsoever. The FBI confirmed the solution shortly afterwards. It is not disputed. And it is worth being precise about what it did and did not achieve, because coverage at the time sometimes blurred this. It did not identify the Zodiac. It did not name a suspect. It did not solve a single one of the murders. The case remains open and the man has never been identified. What it achieved was closing a question that had been open for half a century, and demonstrating something about how hard problems get solved, which is really what this story is about. Consider who solved it, not the NSA, not the FBI, not a university department. A web developer, a mathematician, and a warehouse worker, distributed across 3 continents, none of them paid for it, collaborating over the internet in their own time. The first cipher had been solved by a schoolteacher and his wife at a kitchen table. Both times, the institutions with the resources were beaten by people with an interest. There are reasons for that, and they are not mysterious. Institutions triage. An unsolved cipher with no operational value competes against live cases, and it loses correctly. Nobody at the FBI could justify 14 years on the 340. An amateur has no such constraint. Oranchak could spend 14 years on it precisely because nobody was paying him to spend the time better. And the internet changed what those individuals could reach. Blake's insight was useless without a solver good enough to test 650,000 arrangements. Van Eyck's solver was useless without someone asking the right question about reading order. Neither was useful without Oranchak's published record of dead ends. None of those 3 could have done it alone. All three were reachable by email. There is a further point about the failures, and it is the most useful thing in the whole story. For 50 years, the reason nobody solved the 340 was not insufficient computing power or insufficient cleverness. It was an assumption that the message was read left to right, top to bottom. That assumption was invisible because it was not a decision anyone made. It is simply how text works. You do not notice yourself assuming it, which means you never think to question it. Every failed attempt for half a century was a correct method applied to a wrongly stated problem. The work was not sloppy. It was aimed at something that did not exist. And the solution, when it came, was not a better method. It was the same methods, pointed at the right question. There is a postscript worth including, because it happened less than a year later, and it illustrates the standard the Cipher solution met. In October 2021, a group of former investigators and journalists announced publicly that they had identified the Zodiac. The claim received enormous coverage. It named a man, now dead, and rested on a combination of physical resemblance, circumstantial connections, and a claimed interpretation of some of the writings. Law enforcement did not accept it. The case remained and remains open and unsolved. Set that against the Cipher solution from 10 months earlier, and the difference is instructive. The Cipher solution came with a stated rule that anybody could apply to the original document and get the same result. It was reproducible by strangers. That is why it was accepted within days and has never been seriously challenged. The identification claim was an argument, a reading of evidence, offered by people who found it persuasive. Arguments of that kind have been made about this case for 50 years, about many different men, and every one of them has failed to convince the people who would have to act on it. That is not a criticism of anyone's sincerity. It is a statement about what counts as an answer. A cipher can be solved because a solution proves itself. An identification cannot, without evidence of a completely different kind. A brief word on what remains, because the 340 was not the last of them. Two shorter ciphers attributed to the Zodiac are still unsolved. One is 13 characters sent with a letter claiming it contained his name. The other is 32 characters, accompanying a claim about a bomb location. Neither is likely to be solved, and the reason is not difficulty in the usual sense. They are too short. A cipher is broken by finding a pattern that fits and confirming that no other pattern fits as well. With 13 characters, there is not enough material to do that. Many candidate solutions fit 13 characters. Over the years, people have produced dozens of names that decode from it, which proves the point. If the puzzle admits many answers, it has no answer. That is a genuine mathematical limit, not a failure of effort. The 13-character cipher does not contain enough information to identify its own solution, and no amount of computing power changes that. It is a strange thing to be certain about. Most unsolved problems are unsolved because nobody has been clever enough yet. And the honest position is to keep trying. This one is different. We can prove that the answer cannot be recovered from the material in the same way you can prove that a photograph of a car's rear bumper will never tell you who was driving. So the name, if it was ever there, is not recoverable. Not now, not with better tools, not ever, unless something outside the cipher tells us what it says. And there is a certain grim symmetry in that. The one message he claimed contained his name is the one message that is mathematically guaranteed to keep it. He almost certainly did not intend that. He was taunting, not calculating, but it holds, and it will go on holding after everybody involved is dead. There is a question worth asking before we finish, which is why anyone gives 14 years to something like this. The uncharitable answer is morbid fascination, and it would be dishonest to pretend that plays no part in the enormous public appetite for this case. Some of the attention it has attracted over 50 years has been unpleasant, and some of it has been actively harmful. Men publicly named as suspects on thin evidence, families of the accused harassed, and the families of the people who died having the worst week of their lives repeatedly turned into entertainment. That is worth stating plainly rather than skipping past, because a video about the cipher is itself part of that attention economy. But the codebreakers are a different case, and their motivation seems to have been genuinely simple. A puzzle existed. It had resisted everyone. It was publicly available, It required no permission to attempt, and it could be definitively settled. You would know beyond argument whether you had it. That last quality is rare. Most hard problems do not offer a clean verdict. A cipher does. You either produce the key that turns the whole message into English, or you do not, and no amount of persuasion substitutes. For people who think in that way, an unsolved cipher is close to irresistible, and it has nothing much to do with the crimes. Oranchak has said as much. The appeal was the problem, not the man. And there is something worth noticing in how the solution was received. It named nobody. It solved no murder. It gave the families of the victims nothing they needed. By any practical measure, it changed nothing at all. It was still treated as major news around the world, because a thing that had held out for 51 years had finally given way, and people care about that regardless of what falls out. Let us end with what this case actually shows, beyond the man who has never been caught. The 340 was solved because someone questioned a thing so obvious that nobody had thought of it as an assumption at all. Not the substitution, everyone attacked that. The reading order. And it was solved by people who were not supposed to solve it, using tools they built themselves, coordinating across 3 continents for no reward beyond wanting to know. 51 years for 2 sentences of taunting and a misspelled word. And there is one more asymmetry worth leaving you with. He had at most an afternoon's work in constructing it. Pencil, squared paper, a substitution table, and a diagonal fill. A person could build that cipher in a couple of hours and check it in one more. Against that, half a century, 3 continents, a federal agency, 650,000 tested arrangements, and 14 years of one man's evenings. Hard to make is not the same as hard to break, and the two have almost nothing to do with each other. That is not a fact about this case. It is the oldest fact in cryptography, and it is why the discipline exists at all. The man who wrote it clearly believed he was leaving something clever behind. In a sense, he was. It held for half a century. But what actually survives is not his cleverness. It is the record of 3 strangers who would not let it go, and a schoolteacher's wife who, in 1969, guessed that a man that desperate to be admired would begin by writing the word I. Sources and method. This account draws on the published solution released by David Oranchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl van Aker in December 2020, on the FBI's confirmation of that solution, on Sam Blake's technical write-up of the transposition search, on Oranchak's long-running public documentation of the problem, and on contemporaneous reporting of the ciphers from 1969. Where something is not known, this video says so. The Zodiac has never been identified, no suspect has been charged, and the shorter ciphers remain unsolved and are very likely unsolvable. Out of respect for the families of the people he killed, this video does not describe the attacks or show images of the victims. In September 1995, a man in Schenectady, New York, sat down to read a 35,000-word essay that had just been printed in the Washington Post. He was reading it because his wife had asked him to. She had a suspicion she could not shake, and she wanted him to prove her wrong. He got some way in, and he stopped. Not because of the argument, because of the way it was written, the rhythm of the sentences, certain habits of phrasing he had grown up around. A particular kind of scorn, aimed at a particular kind of person, expressed in a manner he had read in letters for 30 years. David Kaczynski recognized his brother. Over the next 7 months, that recognition ended the longest and most expensive manhunt in the history of the FBI, a case that had run for 17 years, consumed millions of dollars, generated tens of thousands of suspect leads, and produced not one usable piece of physical evidence pointing at anybody. 16 bombings, 3 people dead, 23 injured, and no fingerprint, no witness, no DNA, no informant had brought them any closer. What caught him was a sentence structure. This is the story of a case that could not be solved by forensics, and was solved instead by prose, and of the man who had to decide whether to hand his own brother to a government that might execute him. Because that is the part people forget. David Kaczynski did not simply make a phone call. He made a calculation about his brother's life with no guarantee whatsoever about how it would end, and he made it anyway. Start with why nothing worked for 17 years. The first device went off in May 1978 at Northwestern University near Chicago. A package had been left in a car park, addressed to an engineering professor. It was returned to the name written as the sender, another professor, who handed it to campus security. The officer who opened it was injured. A year later, another device at the same university. Then, in November 1979, something that changed the scale of the investigation entirely. A package placed in the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444 between Chicago and Washington. It did not detonate as intended, it burned. The cabin filled with smoke and the aircraft made an emergency landing. Nobody was killed. But a bomb aboard a passenger aircraft is a federal matter of the most serious kind. And the FBI now had a case with a code name: Universities and Airlines, Unabomber. And from there it ran on and off for the better part of 2 decades. Packages and planted devices. Universities in Utah, Tennessee, California, Michigan, Connecticut. An airline president, a computer shop. Years would pass with nothing, and then another one would arrive. The pattern is worth walking through because its shape is the single most misleading thing about the case. Through the early 1980s, the devices came at irregular intervals and were, in the main, crude. People were hurt. Nobody had yet been killed. The bombs were improving. You can read the sequence as a man teaching himself a craft with no instructor, by trial and observation of results. In December 1985, that changed. A device left in the car park behind a computer rental store in Sacramento killed the man who ran it, Hugh Scruton, when he moved it. He was 28 years old and had no connection to anything the bomber claimed to be fighting except the word computer on his sign. Then, in February 1987, another device outside a computer shop in Salt Lake City. And this time, somebody saw a man place it. A woman working inside looked out of the window. That sighting produced the famous sketch: hood, aviator sunglasses, mustache. And then he stopped. For 6 years, nothing. No packages, no devices, silence. The task force did not know why, and could not know. A gap that long has many possible explanations, and investigators had to hold all of them at once. He had died, he had been imprisoned for something unrelated, he had lost the will, he had moved abroad, he had simply decided to stop. We now know the answer, and it is much simpler. He had been seen. It frightened him, and he went to ground until he judged it safe. That 6-year silence did enormous damage to the investigation, and not in the obvious way. The obvious cost is the lost momentum. The real cost was institutional. A case with no activity is a case that loses people, budget and priority. And by the early 1990s, Unabomber had been running for well over a decade with nothing to show and nothing happening. Then in June 1993, he came back, and came back far more capably than before. 2 packages, 2 days apart. One to a geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco. One to a computer scientist at Yale. Both men opened them. Both were very seriously injured. Both survived. The escalation was clear, the technical quality had jumped, and it was now obvious that the 6 years had not been idleness. They had been practice. The FBI responded with the largest publicity effort it had yet mounted on a domestic case, a reward of $1 million and a dedicated national hotline. And then, in December 1994, an advertising executive named Thomas Mosser was killed by a package delivered to his home in New Jersey. In April 1995, Gilbert Murray, a timber industry lobbyist, was killed by a package at his office in Sacramento. 3 dead, 23 injured, 17 years. We are not going to dwell on the injuries. What matters for this story is the investigative problem, and the investigative problem was extraordinary. Consider what the FBI normally works with. Fingerprints. There were none. He wore gloves and he sanded and treated components. Manufacturing traces. There were none because he did not buy components. He made them. The bombs were assembled from scrap, scavenged wood, hand-carved parts, wire from salvaged appliances, screws and nails and batteries that could have come from anywhere in America. Where a commercial component was necessary, he tended to obliterate the markings. Several devices were built with wood he had shaped himself with hand tools. That is a deliberate defeat of the entire supply chain method of investigation. You cannot trace a purchase that never happened. Witnesses, essentially none. He mailed packages or left them. There is one sketch that became famous, a hooded figure in aviator sunglasses, drawn from a partial sighting in 1987. And it is a reasonable likeness of a man in a hood and sunglasses, which is to say it is a likeness of almost nobody in particular. And he was actively feeding them false leads. Devices carried the initials FC stamped into metal, which the FBI worked on for years. Some contained deliberate planted material intended to point investigators in the wrong direction. He was building the profile he wanted them to have. Then there was the geography problem. Packages were posted from various points, often in Northern California. The targets were spread across the country. There was no home base to work outward from, no cluster to center on. And the profile the Bureau developed, and this is worth being honest about because it is often mocked unfairly, and it was largely reasonable, suggested somebody with technical education, meticulous habits, a grievance against technology, probably operating alone. That profile was broadly correct. It was also useless. It described a suspect pool of many thousands of people and gave no way to narrow it. By the early 1990s, the task force was very large, extremely well-resourced, and completely stuck. It had accumulated an enormous quantity of information about the bomber's methods and psychology, and nothing at all that could put a name to him. It is worth pausing on the scale because it explains why the eventual solution felt almost insulting. At its height, the task force ran to well over 100 people, drawn from the FBI, the Postal Inspection Service, and the Bureau handling alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It occupied dedicated space in San Francisco. Its total cost has been estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. After the reward and the hotline went public, the tips came in by the thousand. Everyone had to be logged. A large number had to be worked. Investigators pursued a great many named suspects to the point of elimination and eliminated everyone. And every one of those thousands of leads had the same structure. Somebody's neighbor, colleague, or estranged relative seemed odd, disliked technology, and kept to themselves. Which was, as it happens, an accurate description of the man they wanted, and also of a very large number of entirely innocent people. That is the trap the investigation was in. Their profile was correct, and it could not discriminate. They had a filter that passed the right answer along with several thousand wrong ones, and no second filter to apply. They needed something that would separate one specific man from everybody else who looked like him. Physical evidence was never going to provide it, because there wasn't any. Now the man they were looking for. Theodore Kaczynski was by any measure exceptionally intelligent. He skipped grades and entered Harvard at 16. He took a doctorate in mathematics at Michigan, in a field of such difficulty that his thesis is described by mathematicians as genuinely formidable work, the kind of result that marks somebody out. In 1967, he became an assistant professor of mathematics at Berkeley, one of the strongest departments in the world, and the youngest ever appointed there at the time. 2 years later, without explanation to anybody, he resigned. That resignation is stranger than it sounds, and it deserves a moment. He was 27. He held a tenure-track post at one of the best mathematics departments on Earth, in a field where such posts are extraordinarily scarce and fiercely competed for. He had produced work his colleagues regarded as genuinely first-rate. The ordinary path in front of him was tenure, a full professorship, and a career. Accounts from the department describe a man who was an uncomfortable and ineffective teacher, quiet to the point of inaudibility, uneasy with students, apparently indifferent to the social machinery of academic life. But that describes a great many mathematicians who nonetheless stay. He gave no reason. He simply handed in his resignation, and when the department head pressed him, he would not explain. He left and never returned to academic work of any kind. Whatever happened, it happened privately, and it was final. Within 2 years, he had left ordinary society altogether. He drifted for a while, and then, in 1971, he and his brother bought a small piece of land outside Lincoln, Montana. Ted built a cabin on it, roughly 10 feet by 12, no electricity, no running water, no telephone. He lived there for the next 25 years. He read, he kept journals, eventually running to tens of thousands of pages, some of it written in a cipher he had devised himself. He grew and hunted some of his own food and took occasional casual work. He rode a bicycle into town for supplies. He borrowed books from the local library. People in Lincoln knew him as a quiet, unkempt, solitary man who kept to himself, which describes a certain number of people in rural Montana and is not a crime. There is a great deal of argument about what happened to him, and it is worth setting out honestly rather than picking a satisfying answer. One strand concerns his time at Harvard, where as an undergraduate he took part in a long-running psychological study conducted by Henry Murray. The study involved subjects writing out their personal beliefs and then being subjected to hostile, deliberately stressful interrogation about them while being filmed. Kaczynski participated over roughly 3 years. Some people treat this as a straightforward explanation. It is not. He was already extremely isolated before he arrived. He was a 16-year-old among older students, and a great many participants in that study did not go on to anything remotely like this. What can be said is that it was an unpleasant experience conducted on a very young and already isolated person, and that he referred to it afterwards with hostility. The other strand is psychiatric. A court-appointed psychiatrist later diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Other clinicians have disputed the diagnosis, and Kaczynski himself rejected it absolutely, to the point of refusing to let his lawyers use it in his defense, which we will come back to, because it turns out to matter enormously. What is not in dispute is that over those Montana years, he developed a fully worked-out position. That industrial technological society was inherently destructive of human freedom, that it could not be reformed, and that it therefore had to be brought down. And he concluded that writing about it was insufficient, that nobody would read an argument from an unknown man in a cabin. That last conclusion is the hinge of the entire case, and he was right about it in the worst possible way. Because in 1995, he found a way to make people read it, and it destroyed him. In April 1995, he wrote to the New York Times with an offer. He had a manuscript, 35,000 words, titled Industrial Society and Its Future. If a major newspaper would publish it in full, he would, in his words, desist from terrorism. This put the United States government in a genuinely difficult position, and the internal argument was real. The case against publishing was obvious and strong. It is capitulation to a man who has killed 3 people. It rewards violence with a national platform. It invites imitation. Every aggrieved person with a grievance and a grudge now knows the price of a front page. And there was no reason at all to believe he would keep his word. The case 4 was narrower, and it was investigative rather than moral. Nothing else had worked in 17 years. This was the largest sample of the man's own words anybody would ever get. Somebody, somewhere, might recognize it. Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh came down in favor of publication, specifically on those grounds, not as a concession, but as a lead generation exercise of last resort. On the 19th of September 1995, the Washington Post printed the entire text as a supplement, with the New York Times sharing the cost. Now that decision has been argued about ever since, and it deserves to be. It was a hostage negotiation conducted in public with the country's most serious newspapers as the instrument. It is not obviously right, but consider what it actually did. For 17 years, the FBI had been trying to identify a man from his physical products, objects deliberately designed to carry no identifying information. And in one morning, they published the one thing he had made that he could not strip of identifying information. You can sand a fingerprint off a piece of wood. You cannot sand your own voice out of 35,000 words of argument. And it is worth being clear about what the document actually was, because manifesto suggests something ranting, and it was not. It opens by stating flatly that the Industrial Revolution and what followed from it have been a disaster for the human race. From there, it proceeds as a long, orderly, numbered argument that technological society necessarily strips people of meaningful control over their own lives, that the political freedoms it offers are consolations rather than remedies, that it cannot be reformed piecemeal because each part depends on the rest, and that it must therefore be brought down with the collapse accepted as the price. It is coldly written. It anticipates objections and answers them in order. It is contemptuous in a very specific and repeated way about a particular type of educated, liberal-minded professional, a target it returns to again and again with a distinctive sneer. That last quality mattered more than any of the arguments. Ideas can be shared by thousands of people. Contempt has a fingerprint, who you despise, and the exact register in which you say so. You could have handed that essay to 100,000 readers who agreed with every word of it, and none would have recognized the author. David Kaczynski recognized it in a few pages because he was not reading the argument. He was hearing a voice he had known since childhood. Which brings us to Schenectady. David Kaczynski was Ted's younger brother by 7 years. He worked with troubled young people. He had, for years, tried to maintain some contact with a brother who was progressively cutting off every relationship he had, including, eventually, that one. Ted had written him letters full of anger. He had rejected their mother. He had told David he wanted no further contact. David's wife, Linda Patrick, was a professor of philosophy. She had never met Ted, but she had heard enough about him, over enough years, that when the coverage of the Unabomber's demands began, she raised a possibility with her husband that he found offensive. He dismissed it. Of course he did. It is a monstrous thing to think about a member of your own family. But when the text was published, she asked him to read it. Simply to read it and settle the question. And he could not settle it. He read a body of argument he had heard before, in letters over decades. The same objections to technology, the same contempt for the same categories of person, the same insistence on a particular kind of reasoning. There was a specific thing, too, and it has become the most quoted detail of the whole case. The manifesto used the phrase, "You can't eat your cake and have it too," the older and, if you think about it, more logical form of the expression, since eating it is what stops you having it. Almost everybody says it the other way round. Ted had used the inverted form in his letters. That is one line. It is not proof, and David knew it was not proof, but it sat on top of everything else. Now hold on to what this man was actually facing. He was not sure. That is the crucial fact. He had a suspicion built on style and instinct about a brother he loved whom he believed to be seriously mentally ill. If he was wrong, he would have handed his brother to the FBI as the most wanted man in America and destroyed what remained of the relationship and of his brother's life for nothing. If he was right and he said nothing, the next person to open a package would die because he had chosen his family over their life. And if he was right and he did speak, the United States would very probably seek to execute his brother. 3 murders, an interstate bombing campaign, an aircraft. There is no version of that case where the death penalty is not on the table. He was choosing, without certainty, between his brother's life and a stranger's. And he had no way to lower the stakes by waiting. That is the cruelty of the position. Waiting would not produce better evidence because there was no more evidence to be had. He had already read everything he was ever going to read. Waiting would only mean that if he was right, the interval belonged to whoever opened the next package. He could not investigate it himself. He could not ask his brother, who had cut off contact years before and would certainly have lied. He could not consult the family because that meant telling his mother what he suspected of her son on the basis of a hunch about sentence structure. So he sat with it, largely alone, for months, testing it, trying to talk himself out of it, hoping each time he reread the thing that the resemblance would dissolve into coincidence. It never did. It got stronger. And every additional detail he found made the position worse rather than better, because each one raised the probability that he was right. And being right was the outcome that cost him everything. He was, in effect, conducting an investigation in which every success was a personal catastrophe. Most people, given that incentive, stopped looking. He did not go straight to the FBI. He hired a lawyer, Anthony Bisegli, and worked through him. He gathered old letters and documents. He tried to keep it anonymous for as long as he could and to move carefully rather than fast. Then he had to convince the FBI, and that was harder than it sounds, because from the Bureau's side, this looked exactly like the several thousand tips they had already worked and eliminated. A relative says a reclusive family member seems to fit. They had heard it many times. What broke through was a document. Among the family papers was a long essay Ted had written years earlier, in the early 1970s, setting out his views on technology and society. written for himself, never published, and utterly unconnected to the case. That essay went to an FBI agent named James Fitzgerald, who had been pushing the argument inside the task force that the manifesto's language was itself evidence and should be analyzed as such. The comparison was not a matter of impressions. It was a systematic examination of vocabulary, syntax, punctuation habits, characteristic constructions, distinctive spellings, and, most tellingly, the particular way an argument was built, anticipated, qualified, and defended. Whole passages of reasoning appeared in both documents, structured the same way, defended against the same objections, in the same order. The conclusion was that they had very probably been written by the same person. Now, this was genuinely novel ground, and it was contested at the time. A search warrant is supposed to rest on probable cause, and the question of whether linguistic comparison could carry that weight had not really been tested. Analyzing an author's style is not fingerprinting. There is no database, no fixed error rate, no agreed methodology of the kind courts prefer. The defense later challenged the warrant precisely on that basis, and the challenge was not frivolous. It did not succeed, partly because by then the cabin had produced a live bomb, the original manuscript, and a written confession running to tens of thousands of pages, which rather overwhelms an argument about the sufficiency of the warrant. But the case is now routinely cited as the point at which forensic linguistics stopped being an academic curiosity and became an investigative tool that American law enforcement took seriously. That gave the FBI what 17 years of physical evidence had not: a name, an address, and enough to go to a judge. And here the government broke faith with him in two stages. The first was a matter of circumstance rather than bad intent. CBS News got hold of the story and prepared to broadcast that the FBI had a suspect and was closing in. That forced the Bureau's hand. A man in an isolated cabin who hears on the radio that agents are coming for him is a man with a live bomb and nothing to lose. The arrest had to be brought forward before the surveillance and the case were fully where investigators wanted them. The second was worse, and it was the thing David had specifically been assured would not happen. Within days of the arrest, his identity as the source leaked to the press. He had come forward through a lawyer, anonymously, on the explicit understanding that his role would be protected. He had a wife, a job, a life, and a family that included a mother who was about to learn that one of her sons had turned in the other. Instead, he was named publicly, immediately, as the brother who had informed. His mother learned what was happening in circumstances nobody would have chosen. The private, agonized decision he had spent 7 months making became a national story with his name attached to it inside a week. He has spoken about that since with notable restraint. But it is a straightforward fact that the man who solved the case was given an assurance and did not get it. On the 3rd of April 1996, agents approached the cabin outside Lincoln, Montana, and arrested Theodore Kaczynski. What they found inside settled it beyond argument. A device, fully assembled and ready to be sent. Components and chemicals. Tools consistent with the bombs. The original typed manuscript of the manifesto. And the journals, tens of thousands of pages, including detailed accounts of the attacks, written in his own hand and partly in his own cipher, which was broken. The man who had spent 18 years ensuring that no physical object could be traced to him had kept a complete written record of everything he had done in his own house. And the cabin itself is worth describing because it is the physical form of the whole argument. 10 feet by 12, one room, a bunk, a stove, a workbench, shelves. Tools, many of them hand tools, and the raw materials of the devices stored in labeled containers. Chemicals, wire, wood he had shaped himself. And books, a great many books, borrowed, bought second-hand, kept. The journals were the extraordinary part. Tens of thousands of pages accumulated over a quarter of a century in which he recorded his reasoning, his reading, his experiments, his intentions, and his results. Where he wanted secrecy, he used a numerical cipher of his own construction, which was broken. The whole structure was later removed intact and taken away as evidence, and it has been publicly exhibited since. A 10 by 12 wooden box containing everything one man needed in order to spend 25 years thinking himself into a position where killing strangers seemed like an argument. It is also worth saying what became of the people he attacked, because true crime has a bad habit of losing them. David Galernta, the Yale computer scientist injured in 1993, survived with permanent damage to his hand, his eye, and his hearing. He went on writing and working. He later received a letter from Kaczynski from prison, and his response was public and unsparing. He had no interest in dialogue, and he refused to treat the man as a thinker to be engaged with, rather than someone who had tried to kill him by post. That is a useful corrective to a certain way of discussing this case. The manifesto is studied in universities. The people it was written in the blood of are not a footnote to it. That is the part that is hardest to explain, and it is of a piece with the manifesto. He wanted to be read. It was the whole point. He had constructed a life around the conviction that his argument mattered more than anything else, and a man who believes that cannot bring himself to destroy the record of it. Then came the trial, and the second impossible decision, this time his brother's. David had gone to the authorities having sought, through his lawyer, some indication that the death penalty would not be pursued. He did not get a guarantee because no such guarantee was available, and the government did initially move to seek execution. Meanwhile, Ted's own defense team wanted to argue that he was mentally ill. It was, on the evidence, their strongest available argument, and very possibly the only thing that would keep him alive. He refused, absolutely and repeatedly. To permit that defense would be to concede that his ideas were symptoms, that the work of his adult life was a disease rather than an argument. He would rather be executed as a rational man than spared as a mad one. He attempted to dismiss his lawyers. He asked to represent himself. The court refused. In January 1998, he pleaded guilty to all charges and accepted life imprisonment without the possibility of release, avoiding a trial and avoiding the death penalty. He was sent to the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, and he stayed in the federal system until his death in 2023. There was a reward for information in the case of $1 million. David Kaczynski qualified for it. He gave the great majority of it, after legal costs, to the families of the people his brother had killed. He spent much of the rest of his life speaking publicly against the death penalty. And his brother never forgave him. Ted refused contact. He wrote about the betrayal with a bitterness he never revised. As far as the public record goes, he went to his death regarding his brother as the man who had destroyed him, and nothing else. David Kaczynski saved lives, gave away the money, and got no reconciliation at all. That is the actual ending. It is not a satisfying one, and it should not be smoothed over. So what does this case actually show? 3 things, and they are more interesting than the usual telling. The first is about what evidence is. For 17 years, the finest investigative resources in the world were pointed at physical objects and lost, because the objects had been engineered by an intelligent man specifically to say nothing. The FBI was not incompetent. It was working on material that had been deliberately emptied of information. What it could not get from wood and wire, it got from syntax. Because a person can control what they buy, what they touch, and what they leave behind, and cannot easily control the shape of their own sentences. The habits that identify a writer are, by definition, the ones they are not conscious of. That is precisely why they identify them. He knew to wear gloves. It did not occur to him that his prose was also a fingerprint, because to him, his prose was simply the correct way to express a correct idea. The second is about the price of being heard. Every single thing that caught him flowed from his need for an audience. He kept the journals because the record mattered. He wrote the manifesto because the argument mattered. He offered to stop killing in exchange for publication because being read mattered more to him than continuing. He was safe as long as he stayed silent, and he could not stay silent. The demand that ended the campaign was the same demand that ended him. And the third is the one that has nothing to do with investigation. The case was closed because one man read something in a newspaper, recognized a voice, and decided that the possibility of being right obliged him to act, knowing he might be wrong, knowing what it would cost him if he was right, and knowing he would probably lose his brother either way. There was no forensic breakthrough. There was no informant motivated by money. The money came afterwards, and he gave it away. There was a private decision made by a person with no obligation to make it that a stranger's life outweighed his own family. Most of the story is about a very intelligent man, who spent 25 years constructing a case that ordinary human bonds were an obstacle to be discarded. It ended because his brother did not agree. Sources and method. This account draws on the federal charging documents and plea agreement in the Unabomber prosecution, contemporaneous reporting from 1995 and 1996, including the circumstances of the manifesto's publication, David Kaczynski's own extensive public account of his decision, published material on the forensic linguistic comparison, and the court record concerning the disputed psychiatric diagnosis and the defendant's refusal to permit a mental illness defense. Where the record is genuinely contested, the diagnosis and the weight properly given to the Harvard study, this video sets out the competing positions rather than choosing the most dramatic one. Details of the injuries have been deliberately kept minimal. The people who were killed and hurt were not the subject of this story and are not material for it. In February 2005, a man who had evaded capture for 31 years sat down and asked the police a question. He did it the way he did everything, carefully, in writing, through a message left where he knew they would find it. He wanted to know whether a floppy disk could be traced back to the computer that wrote it. If he sent them one, could they follow it home? It was a reasonable question. He had spent 3 decades being careful. He had never left a fingerprint they could use. He had never been seen well enough to be identified. He had walked away from crime scenes in a city that was hunting him and gone back to an ordinary life so unremarkable that nobody around him ever wondered. And the police, who by this point understood him better than he understood himself, took out a classified advertisement in the Wichita Eagle. It said the disc would be fine. It was a lie. It was a lie printed in a newspaper, in a public notice, in a form he had himself proposed. And he believed it. He sent the disc. Inside a deleted document on it, invisible unless you knew to look, was the name of a church and a first name. 3 days later, he was under arrest. Dennis Rader had killed 10 people. He had taunted the police in letters for 31 years. He was the president of his church congregation council, a Cub Scout leader, a city compliance officer who measured people's grass and impounded their dogs. He had a wife and 2 children who knew nothing. And what ended it was not DNA, not a witness, not a confession, and not a fingerprint. It was metadata. A few dozen bytes of housekeeping that a word processor wrote into a file without being asked, and that he did not know existed. This is the story of how the most careful man in Kansas was caught by a computer being tidy. And it is worth saying at the outset what this video will not do. It will not walk you through what he did to the people he killed. Those details are a matter of public record, and they are not the story here. The story is the investigation and the strange 30-year silence in the middle of it, and the question of why a man who had got away with it completely picked up a pen and started writing again. Because that is the part that has no comfortable answer. Start with the city and with 1974. Wichita, Kansas, is a mid-sized American city on the plains. An aviation town, flat, ordinary, the sort of place people describe as somewhere nothing happens. In January 1974, 4 members of one family were killed in their home in the space of a morning. A husband, a wife, and 2 of their children. The 2 older children came home from school and found what had happened. That is as far as we are going to go into it, and it is far enough to understand what the city was dealing with. It was not a killing that made sense. There was no robbery, no dispute, no obvious motive, nothing that fitted the ordinary categories detectives work in. 2 more women were killed that same year, in the spring and the winter, in circumstances that suggested the same person. And in October 1974, a man rang the Wichita Public Library and told a librarian to look in a particular engineering book on a particular shelf. Inside it was a letter. The letter claimed responsibility for the family killed in January. It contained details that had not been released. It complained at some length and with evident irritation that the newspapers had been reporting the case wrongly and that another man was being wrongly suspected. And it asked for a name. That is a genuinely strange document, and it is the key to the entire case. He was not writing to threaten anybody or to make demands. He was writing because the coverage was inaccurate and it annoyed him, and because the killings had not yet been recognized as a series, as his series. He wanted the record corrected, and he wanted a label. Consider how much risk that letter cost him for no operational gain whatsoever. He had to obtain the book, write the document, travel to a public library, place it, and then telephone to make sure it was found. Every step an opportunity to be seen, remembered, or recorded. A man whose only goal was to avoid capture would have done none of it. There was nothing to correct that threatened him. Being wrongly reported is not being caught. He proposed several, and the one he settled on was an acronym describing his method: bind, torture, kill. We are going to use it as little as possible in this video because he chose it, and because a name he selected for himself is a piece of self-promotion he is still receiving 30 years after the fact. But it is the name the case is known by, and pretending otherwise would be silly. Now hold on to the thing that letter reveals, because everything that follows turns on it. He was not caught in 1974. He was never close to being caught in 1974. He had, by any practical measure, got away with it. And it was not enough. Being unknown was intolerable to him. He needed the killings to be attributed, to be understood as a body of work with an author, even an anonymous one. That need is the only reason anybody ever learned his name. Through the later 1970s, the letters continued at intervals. Poems, a message sent to a television station, letters to newspapers. Each one containing details that confirmed authenticity, each one written in a style that mixed bureaucratic formality with self-conscious drama. More people were killed in 1977, in 1985, in 1986, in 1991. 10 in total across 17 years, though the full count was only established afterwards. And in December 1977, he did something that tells you more about him than any letter. He killed a young woman in her home, and then he walked to a payphone and rang the police to report it himself. The call was short. He gave the address and told them they would find a homicide there, and hung up. That recording survived. It was played publicly for years afterwards in the hope that somebody would recognize the voice. Thousands of people heard it. Nobody who knew him ever placed it, which is its own small horror because plenty of people knew him. Think about what that call was for. He gained nothing operationally. Reporting it brought police to the scene faster than they would otherwise have come, which is straightforwardly against his interest. He did it so the killing would be found and attributed and counted. Left undiscovered for days, it was nothing. Reported, it entered the record that night. He had, in effect, filed a report on his own work. And that is exactly the shape of the man. A person for whom a thing that is not documented has not properly happened. The letters and poems continued in that vein. A poem about that same victim was sent to the Wichita Eagle. Another followed about a woman he had gone to kill in 1979 who simply never came home that evening. He had waited inside her house for hours, given up, and then, months later, wrote to her about it, so that she would know how close it had been. That last one deserves a moment because it is almost the purest expression of the whole pattern. Nothing happened. There was no crime to report and no body to find. And he still could not leave it alone because an event nobody knew about was, to him, a waste. He would rather be known and hunted than unknown and safe. Every single thing that eventually caught him follows from that one preference. And the investigation, meanwhile, was doing everything it could think of and getting nowhere. Understand the position they were in, because it is easy to be unfair about it from here. There was no DNA testing available for most of this period. The techniques that would eventually confirm his identity did not exist when the first killings happened, and were not routine for years afterwards. There was no national database of anything much. Records were paper, cross-referencing meant people reading files. The letters were examined for fingerprints and produced nothing usable. He was careful with them, and postal handling degrades what little there might be. Handwriting was avoided. He typed or printed in block capitals. They had psychological profiles, and those profiles were reasonable and largely correct. An organized, methodical individual, probably employed, probably with some connection to law enforcement or security or the military. Likely married and outwardly conventional. That last part was right, and it was the part nobody wanted to believe. But a profile that describes a conventional married man with a steady job in a city of 300,000 people is not a lead. It is a description of half the population. Thousands of tips were worked, suspects were investigated and eliminated. At one stage, the task force had a list of names running into the thousands. In the mid-1980s, a dedicated task force was formed to work nothing else. It was given a nickname, and it did what such units do. It built card indexes, it cross-referenced, it took blood samples and handwriting exemplars from men who fitted the profile, and it eliminated them one by one. Consider what fitting the profile meant in practice. Investigators went looking for men of roughly the right age, with some technical or security background. In a city where the largest employers built aircraft and the surrounding counties were full of ex-servicemen. Thousands qualified. They took samples from more than 1,000 men over the years. Everyone came back negative, which is not a failure. Each was a name correctly removed. But an elimination is only progress if the list is finite, and this list was, for practical purposes, the adult male population of a metropolitan area. There is a detail here that people find hard to accept, and it is worth stating plainly because hindsight makes fools of everyone. He was interviewed at no point. He was never a suspect. His name did not appear on the list. Not because the investigators were careless, but because nothing about him generated a reason to write it down. He had no criminal record of the relevant kind. He was married, employed, a homeowner, a churchgoer. He had no complaints against him beyond being unusually strict about municipal ordinances, which is not a category police search on. The profile said, "Look for an ordinary man," and the difficulty with that instruction is that it is not a search. It is a description of the haystack. And then, after 1991, it stopped. No more killings, no more letters, nothing. For 13 years, silence. Now, a 13-year gap is a problem of a particular kind for an investigation, and it is worth thinking about what it does to a case. The obvious explanations were all live. He had died. He had moved away. He was in prison for something unconnected. He had become too old or too ill. He had simply stopped, whatever that means. Investigators cannot distinguish between those from the outside. There is no evidence produced by absence. What a long silence actually does is dissolve the institutional case. Detectives retire, budgets go elsewhere. The dedicated task force becomes one detective with a box, and then a box in storage. Not through negligence, through the ordinary arithmetic of a police department with current crimes to solve. By the early 2000s, the case was cold in the fullest sense. It had not been forgotten in Wichita, where it never would be, but it was history rather than an active investigation. It is worth asking what he was doing in those years, because the answer complicates the idea that he had stopped. By his own later account, he had not stopped wanting to. He continued to select people, to watch them, to plan. The preparatory behavior that had always preceded the killings, and simply did not carry it through. He described periods of intent that came to nothing, sometimes because circumstances failed, and sometimes because he chose to break off. He also spent those years maintaining an archive. He kept material relating to what he had done, filed and stored, at home and in his workplace. He wrote about himself. The documentation habit never lapsed for a moment, only the killing did. Which means the 13-year silence was not remission, and it was not reform. It was a man continuing to be exactly what he was, in private, with the public component switched off. And that matters for how we read 2004. He did not relapse or snap. Nothing was reawakened because nothing had gone to sleep. A newspaper column simply reminded him that the audience existed, and the part of him that had never stopped writing picked up where it left off. And then, in 2004, something happened that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted. The Wichita Eagle ran a retrospective piece. It was the 30th anniversary of the first killings, and a columnist wrote about the case, about the family, about the years, about the fact that it had never been solved. Around the same time, a local lawyer was working on a book about it. Ordinary journalism, a commemoration. In March 2004, a letter arrived at the Eagle. Inside were photographs of a crime scene from 1986 and a photocopy of the victim's driving license. It was a murder that had never been publicly connected to the series. He was back. Now stop and consider what that means, because it is the single most important fact in the case. He had stopped killing 13 years earlier. He was in no danger. The investigation had gone cold. He was in his late 50s, employed, married, a church officer, a man whose life had proceeded quietly to the point where he was utterly beyond suspicion. Nothing whatsoever compelled him to write that letter. There was no pressure, no threat, no provocation beyond a newspaper column marking an anniversary. What he could not tolerate was being finished. The book, the retrospective, the tone of it, the case was becoming history. Something concluded and studied, rather than something ongoing with him at the center of it. So he re-entered the story to correct that impression, exactly as he had in 1974, when the coverage annoyed him. The same need, 30 years apart, produced the same behavior, and this time the world had computers in it. What followed over the next 11 months was, from the investigation's point of view, an extraordinary gift. He sent package after package, puzzles, word games, documents in envelopes, items left in the beds of pickup trucks and in public parks and taped to road signs, a cereal box left in a rural mailbox, a doll wrapped with a bag over its head left in a park, which is as ugly a detail as this video is going to include, and is included because it shows how far he had gone from taunting into performance. Each one was communication, each one was a physical object that had traveled from his hands to theirs. And he numbered them. That is not a detail people usually register, and it is the most revealing thing in the whole 11 months. He was keeping count. He treated the correspondence as a series with an index, the way a clerk treats a case file, so that the record would be complete and in order, and so that anyone reading it later would be able to follow the sequence without gaps. He also began sending material about himself, not confessions exactly, biography. Documents describing his own development, written in the third person, drafted as though for a future reader who would need the background explained. He was, quite literally, compiling his own archive and posting it to the people investigating him. Meanwhile, the physical objects were accumulating in an evidence room, and each one was an opportunity. A cereal box that had been handled, tape, envelopes, cardstock. Every item had been touched, carried, prepared somewhere private, and then placed somewhere public, which meant every item was a chance he would slip and a chance he might be seen placing it. At least one drop was captured on a security camera at the business where he left it. The footage showed a vehicle. It was not enough to identify anybody, but it narrowed things, and it demonstrates the shape of the risk he was running 11 times over. None of that is what got him, but it is why the police were content to let the conversation continue rather than cutting it off. Every package was another roll of the dice in their favor, and they only needed to win once. He, by contrast, needed to win every time, and he had chosen, for no reason anybody forced on him, to keep playing. And the police did something clever, which is worth understanding properly, because it is the actual investigative work in this story. They did not treat these as evidence to be catalogued and filed. They treated them as a conversation, and they set about managing it. They kept the tone respectful in public. They avoided ridiculing him, because ridicule ends a conversation. They responded to the messages in ways that encouraged more. A local detective became the public face of the case and spoke about him in measured terms. Their working theory, correct as it turned out, was that his need for recognition would keep him writing, and that every additional item was another chance for a mistake. They were, in effect, running a source who did not know he was a source. And the strategy is worth taking seriously because it ran against instinct at every point. The instinctive response to a man taunting the police is to refuse to play, to give him nothing, to deny him the attention, to make clear he is a criminal rather than an adversary worth answering. That instinct is morally clean, and it would have been a disaster. What they did instead was harder to stomach. They spoke about him publicly in level, almost courteous terms. They acknowledged his messages. They treated the exchange as a channel to be kept open rather than an insult to be rebuffed. Understand the calculation. 31 years of physical evidence had produced nothing. The only thing generating new material was his own compulsion to communicate, and that compulsion was fragile. A man who felt ridiculed or ignored might simply stop, and if he stopped, there was nothing left. So the case was not solved by outthinking him. It was solved by keeping him talking long enough for him to make one mistake, and by understanding that the way to keep him talking was to take him seriously. There is something bleak in that, and it should be said rather than dressed up. The investigators had to give a man who killed 10 people exactly what he wanted, an audience that responded, in order to stop him. They knew it and did it anyway, because the alternative was another decade of silence. It is also why the lie about the disc worked so well. By February 2005, he was not receiving a message from his hunters. He was receiving a reply from a correspondent. 11 months of measured, respectful engagement had quietly converted an adversary into somebody whose word he would take. They did not trick him with the advertisement. They spent the best part of a year earning the position from which a single sentence would be believed. Then, in January 2005, he asked his question. He wanted to know whether a floppy disk could be traced. He proposed the arrangement himself. He would send communications on disk rather than on paper if it was safe. And he specified how to answer. Run a classified advertisement in the Eagle. If it said a particular phrase, he would take that as confirmation. The police ran the ad. Pause on this, because it is genuinely remarkable and it gets skipped over as a piece of trivia. He had spent 31 years trusting nobody. He had constructed a life of complete concealment. He had outlasted an entire generation of detectives. And then he asked the police, the people hunting him, the only people on Earth with an interest in his capture, for technical advice about his own operational security. And when they told him what he wanted to hear, in a newspaper, in public, he believed it. There is no way to explain that except as the same thing that produced the first letter in 1974. By 2005, he was not primarily hiding from them, he was corresponding with them. 30 years of one-way communication had produced in his mind a relationship. And inside a relationship, you can ask a question and expect a straight answer. The lie worked because he had stopped being able to see them as adversaries. In February 2005, a package arrived at a Wichita television station. Inside was a purple floppy disk. On the disk was a document. It was a message of the kind he had been sending for a year. Instructions, complaints, the usual mixture. And the police did the obvious thing, which was to examine not just what the document said, but what the file itself contained. Here is the part that matters, and it is worth being precise because it is usually described vaguely. When you write a document in a word processor, the program stores more than the words. It records administrative information about the file, when it was created, when it was last modified, and, crucially, identifying details drawn from the software's own configuration and from documents previously worked on. None of that is displayed. You do not see it when you open the file. It is not part of the text. The document on that disk had been created on a computer where the software had been registered or used under a particular first name. And the file retained traces of earlier work done on the same machine, including a deleted document associated with an organization. The organization was Christ Lutheran Church. The first name was Dennis. It is worth being clear about why that information was there at all, because the computer betrayed him makes it sound like surveillance, and it was nothing of the kind. Metadata exists for mundane reasons. Software records who last saved a file so that a shared document can show it. It records timestamps so that files can be sorted and backups compared. It carries fragments of an application's own configuration, the name it was registered under, recently opened documents, because those are the things a word processor needs to offer you a sensible list next time you open it. None of it was designed to identify anybody. It is housekeeping. It is the digital equivalent of a workshop leaving sawdust on everything that passes through it. And critically, it is written automatically, it is not shown to you, and deleting the visible text does not remove it. He could have read that document 100 times and seen nothing but his own words. That is the precise gap he fell into. His entire model of caution was about controlling what he sent the words, the paper, the fingerprints, the handwriting. Every one of those is something a person can inspect before letting it go. Metadata is the first thing in the history of his caution that he could not inspect. It traveled with the file invisibly, and it described the machine that made it. There is a version of this story where he was simply out of date, and that is true but too kind to the rest of us. He had used a computer for years. He was, by the standards of a man in his late 50s in 2005, reasonably capable with one. What he lacked was not skill, but a category. The idea that a file could contain anything he had not put there. You cannot be careful about a risk you do not know is a risk. That is not a failure of diligence. It is a failure of imagination, and it is the ordinary way careful people come unstuck. That is it. That is the whole break in the case. A church and a first name sitting in a part of a file that its author did not know was there. Investigators looked up the church. Its website listed the officers of the Congregation Council. The president was a man named Dennis Rader. Then they did the ordinary police work that turns a lead into an arrest. They looked at him, his employment, his address history, his movements. He had lived close to some of the sites. His work as a compliance officer had taken him into neighborhoods across the city, legitimately in a uniform, knocking on doors, a role that gave him reason to be almost anywhere and to be forgotten immediately. And they obtained a confirmation using a method that is worth explaining because it is often misunderstood. Investigators secured a court order for a tissue sample held by a medical facility. A routine sample taken years earlier from Rader's adult daughter as part of ordinary healthcare. Compared against DNA recovered from the original crime scenes, it showed a familial match. The profile from the scenes belonged to a close relative of the woman whose sample it was. That is not genetic genealogy, and the distinction matters. Nobody trawled a family tree or a consumer database. They already had a suspect from the disc. The sample confirmed him. The DNA closed the case, but it did not open it. On the 26th of February 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over near his home and arrested. He confessed at length, and the manner of it was the last thing that unsettled people. In court, asked to establish the factual basis for his plea, he did not break down or refuse or minimize. He recited 10 counts, one after another, in a flat administrative voice, supplying dates and addresses and procedural detail, occasionally correcting the judge on a point of accuracy. It was, by every account of people in that room, like listening to a man deliver a compliance report. That is not theatre, and it is not remorse withheld for effect. It is the same register as the letters, the same register as the numbered packages, the same register as a man who rang the police to make sure a killing got recorded. The bureaucratic manner was never a costume over something else. It was the thing itself. Asked why, he offered a phrase of his own devising, a name for the compulsion, as though it were a component in a system rather than something he had chosen. Naming it let him describe himself as a person to whom something had happened. Nobody is obliged to accept that framing, and the court did not. Because the killings predated Kansas reinstating the death penalty, the maximum available was imprisonment. He received 10 consecutive life sentences. He remains in prison and will die there. And then there is the part that gets least attention and deserves more. His wife had been married to him for 34 years. His 2 children had grown up in that house. His congregation had elected him their council president. None of them had any idea, and all of them found out in public, at the same time as everybody else, because a name on a church website matched a name inside a computer file. His wife was granted an emergency divorce. The family's name was in every newspaper in the country within days. They had done nothing. They were, in the most literal sense, the last people he deceived, and the ones with the least warning and the fewest resources to absorb it. Any account of this case that treats them as background is telling it wrong. So what does this case actually show? Because there are 3 things here, and only one of them is about computers. The first is the one everybody takes away, and it is true as far as it goes. He was defeated by a technology he did not understand. He had built his caution in the 1970s, around the threats of the 1970s, fingerprints, handwriting, being seen. He updated his methods barely at all. When he moved from typewriters to a computer, he carried his old model of risk across, and that model had nothing in it about a file describing itself. Metadata is invisible, automatic, and written without asking. Every assumption he had about controlling what he sent was formed before such a thing existed. That is a real lesson, and it generalizes. The danger in any system is rarely the part you are watching. It is the part you do not know is running. And it is worth noticing how ordinary the failure was, because the temptation is to file it as a quirk of one strange man in 2005. Every one of us is now surrounded by processes that write things down without asking. Photographs record where they were taken. Documents record who made them. Devices keep logs. Nobody reads until somebody has a reason to. None of that is sinister, and almost all of it is useful. And almost none of it is visible at the moment you decide something is safe to send. He is an extreme case of a completely normal condition, a person whose sense of what he was revealing was formed by an older set of tools and who never updated it because nothing forced him to. The gap between what he thought he was sending and what he actually sent had been widening for years before it mattered. It only mattered once, but that is how these things work. The exposure is continuous and the consequence is a single event. But the second thing is more interesting, and it is about the 13 years. He stopped. For 13 years he did not kill and did not write, and in that period he was, functionally, safe. Had he simply continued being an unremarkable man in Wichita, the case would very likely never have been solved. The physical evidence was decades old, the investigation was cold, and nothing was moving. He was undone by a newspaper article marking an anniversary, not by anything the police did, and not by anything he was forced into. It is worth sitting with how narrow that is. Had nobody written about the 30th anniversary, had the columnist chosen a different subject that week, had the book never been started, there is no obvious mechanism by which this case gets solved. The DNA from the scenes existed, but DNA only identifies someone you can compare it against, and he was in no database and on no list. The letters had been examined to exhaustion. The task force was gone. He would have retired, drawn a pension, remained president of his church council, and died an old man in Kansas with 10 killings unattributed. That is not a comfortable thing to conclude about an investigation that eventually succeeded. But it is what the record shows, and pretending otherwise would credit the police with a break they did not get, and he handed them. What he could not bear was to be concluded. Being unknown, he had endured for 3 decades. Being finished, he could not, because it meant the thing he had made was over and belonged to historians. So he wrote, and having written once, he could not stop, and 11 months later he asked his hunters for advice and took it. The whole case turns on that need, and it is the same need that produced the library letter in 1974. He was, from the very beginning, someone who required an audience, and an audience is the one thing you cannot have anonymously. The third thing is about how he lived, and it is the part that unsettles people most. He was a compliance officer. He inspected properties, enforced ordinances about grass length and animals, and had a reputation for being officious about it. He was president of his church council. He had been a Cub Scout leader. He had served in the Air Force. He was married for more than 3 decades. Nobody suspected him. Not his wife, not his children, not his colleagues, not his congregation. There is a comfortable way to tell that, which is to say he wore a mask. But the people who have studied him carefully tend to reject that framing, and so should we, because it makes it tidier than it is. The officiousness was not a disguise adopted to blend in. It was genuinely him, a man drawn to rules, procedure, documentation, and the small exercise of authority over other people. The letters read like the work of a bureaucrat, numbered, formal, aggrieved about accuracy, concerned with correct attribution. The same character that made him a tiresome compliance officer is legible in every letter he sent, which is why the profile was right and useless at once. It correctly described a methodical, conventional, employed married man, and that is not a hiding place he cleverly found. It is simply what he was. This is the point at which people usually reach for the word monster, and it is worth resisting, not out of sympathy, but out of accuracy. Monster is a comforting category. It says, this person was a different kind of thing, recognizable if you had looked properly, and therefore the failure to spot him was somebody's fault. It puts distance between him and the ordinary world. But the record does not support it. 34 years of marriage, 2 children raised, decades of steady employment. A congregation that elected him to office and a scout pack that trusted him with their sons. He was not hiding among normal people. By every external measure, he was one, and he was one on the same days he was not. The uncomfortable finding is that those two things ran in parallel for 31 years without either interfering with the other. There was no breakdown, no visible strain, no moment where the mask slipped and somebody wondered. That is what the case actually demonstrates, and it is why it still disturbs people 2 decades on. Not that a monster walked among them undetected, but that no detection was possible because there was nothing on the outside to detect. The only thing that ever gave him away was the one part of him that insisted on being seen. There is a final detail, and it belongs at the end because it is the whole case in one image. He asked whether it was safe. He was told yes in a newspaper advertisement by the people hunting him. A man who had trusted no one for 31 years chose, at the very end, to trust the only party in the world guaranteed to lie to him, because after 3 decades of writing letters into silence, being answered at all mattered more to him than being careful. He got his answer. He sent the disc. And the file, without being asked and without him ever knowing, had already written his name inside itself. There is one last thing worth holding on to, and it is not about him. The people he killed were not characters in his story, however hard he worked to make them so. They had names, families, jobs, and futures, and the reason we know his name at all is that a great many people refused to let theirs be forgotten. Detectives who kept the files, journalists who marked the anniversary, families who would not let it be closed quietly. He came back in 2004 because a newspaper column reminded him that people were still paying attention. He assumed that attention was for him. It was not. It was for them. And it is the only reason he was ever caught. Sources and method. This account draws on the Kansas court record of the prosecution and the guilty plea, the affidavit supporting the arrest, contemporaneous reporting from the Wichita Eagle and national outlets across 2004 and 2005, and published accounts by investigators involved in the communication strategy of the final year. Where a popular version of the story is imprecise, this video says so, in particular the frequent claim that the case was solved by genetic genealogy. It was not. The identification came from file metadata on a floppy disk. A familial DNA comparison, obtained by court order from an existing medical sample, confirmed a suspect the disk had already produced. Details of the killings themselves have been deliberately kept to the minimum needed to follow the investigation. The people he killed were not material for a story about a computer file, and this account does not treat them as such. On the night of the 31st of July 1977, a traffic officer in Brooklyn wrote a parking ticket. A cream-colored Ford Galaxy was standing too close to a fire hydrant on Bay 17th Street in a quiet residential neighborhood called Bensonhurst. The officer wrote the summons, tucked it under the wiper, and moved on. It was one of a handful of tickets issued on that street that night, and among the tens of thousands issued across New York that summer, it was nothing at all. At that moment, the largest manhunt in the history of the New York Police Department was in its 12th month. 300 officers were assigned to it full-time. The city had put up the biggest reward in its history. Tens of thousands of tips had been logged, hundreds of suspects checked, psychics consulted, handwriting analyzed, patterns mapped. None of it had produced a name. The parking ticket had the name on it. Within 11 days, the man who owned that Ford Galaxy would be in custody, and the case that had terrorized a city of 7 million people would be over. Not because of the profile or the task force or the reward, but because a car had been left next to a fire hydrant and somebody had done the most boring job in law enforcement correctly. This is the story of the son of Sam case, of the year New York was genuinely afraid, of the man who wrote letters to the police and the press while the city hunted him, and of how the whole thing was ended by a piece of paper that nobody involved considered important. And it is a story worth telling carefully, because the popular version gets the emphasis wrong. It remembers the letters and the demon dog and the tabloid frenzy, and forgets that the actual solution came from a dog walker who almost didn't phone, and a filing system. One note before we start. 6 people were killed in this case, and 7 more were badly wounded, most of them young, most of them sitting in parked cars doing nothing more dangerous than talking. We are not going to walk through what was done to them. What matters here is the investigation, and the victims are not material for it. They are the reason it mattered. And one more thing this case offers that the others we have covered do not: a control experiment in what fear does to a modern city. Wichita was afraid of BTK, but Wichita's fear was chronic, spread across 17 years. New York's was acute, 12 months, 7 million people, a media apparatus pouring petrol on it daily, and the record of what that did is unusually rich, because everyone who lived through the summer of 1977 seems to have written about it. The empty discos, the hair salons doing a run on shortcuts, the boyfriend who made his girlfriend crouch below the dashboard on the drive home, the parents sleeping badly until they heard the key in the door. A city is a machine for strangers trusting each other, and for 1 year the machine ran with the trust removed. That, as much as the body count, is what he did. And it is worth keeping in view as we go, because the fear was not a side effect of the crimes. On the evidence of the letters, it was the product he was most proud of. Start with the city, because the fear is the context for everything. New York in 1976 and 1977 was a city already in trouble. It had nearly gone bankrupt the year before. That story is on our finance channels. Services were cut. The subway was covered in graffiti, and crime was at historic highs. In July 1977, a blackout would shut the entire city down for a night and set off widespread looting. The tabloids were in a circulation war. The mood was raw. Into that city in the summer of 1976 came something new. On the 29th of July 1976, 2 young women were sitting in a parked car outside an apartment building in the Bronx, talking after a night out. A man walked up to the car and without a word fired into it. Donna Loria, who was 18, was killed. Her friend was wounded and survived. There was no robbery, no argument, no connection between the shooter and the young women. Nothing that made sense to the detectives who caught the case, and nothing to work with. A stranger had walked out of the dark, fired, and walked back into it. An unsolvable case in the ordinary run of things, one folder among many in a violent year. Then it happened again. In October, a couple sitting in a parked car in Queens. In November, 2 young women on a stoop. In January 1977, a couple in a parked car, Christine Freund, was killed. In March, a student named Virginia Voskarishian was shot walking home from the subway. In April, another couple in a parked car in the Bronx, Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau, both killed. By then, the police had something. Ballistics had matched the bullets. Every one of these shootings had been done with the same weapon, a Charter Arms Bulldog, a 5-shot revolver chambered in .44 caliber, a distinctive and relatively uncommon gun. That match changed everything because it meant this was one person. The press named him the .44 caliber killer, and New York understood that somebody was hunting young people at random and that nobody knew who he was, what he looked like, or why. Now the pattern, because everyone, police and public alike, was trying to find the rule. He shot couples in parked cars mostly, late at night mostly, in the outer boroughs, Queens, the Bronx, Brooklyn, never Manhattan. Many of the young women had long dark hair, and that detail took on a life of its own. Across the city that year, women cut their hair short, dyed it blonde, bought wigs. Discos and lovers' lanes in Queens emptied. Parents imposed curfews on grown daughters. Restaurants in the affected neighborhoods reported business collapsing. Whether the hair detail was ever really a rule is genuinely unclear. Investigators themselves went back and forth, and the later victims did not all fit it. But that is what fear does with a pattern. It finds one because a rule you can follow feels safer than randomness. If he only shoots girls with long dark hair, then cutting your hair is a defense. The alternative, that there was no rule and no defense, was unbearable, so the city believed in the rule. Then, in April 1977, at the scene of the Suriani and Esau shooting, he left a letter. It was addressed to Captain Joseph Borelli of the NYPD, and it was unlike anything the detectives had seen. Rambling, strange, written in block capitals, veering between menace and something almost plaintive. It rejected the idea that he hated women, and it gave him the name that replaced the tabloids one. I am the son of Sam. He said Sam was his father. Sam, the letter implied, was a being who commanded him. The letter promised he was not finished. A second letter followed at the end of May. This one not to the police but to Jimmy Breslin. the most famous newspaper columnist in New York, at the Daily News. It was literate in a broken way, taunting and theatrical, asking to be remembered, name-checking the victims, and promising more. Breslin and the Daily News published it, after consultation with the police, in the hope it would produce recognition. Somebody, somewhere, knowing the voice. The day it ran, the paper sold over 1 million copies. And here we have to be honest about something uncomfortable, because it is part of the machinery of the case. The killer and the press were now in a relationship, and both sides were feeding it. He wanted an audience, the letters were written to be published, and they worked. The tabloids wanted circulation, and fear sold papers in numbers nobody had seen before. The city's terror was being amplified by the same channel the police hoped would catch him. Nobody comes out of that clean, and it set a template, the named killer as media character, that the press has never entirely put down since. If you have watched our Zodiac episode, you will recognize the shape, the letters, the self-chosen name, the newspapers as a stage. The difference is that Zodiac was never caught. This man was, and not by anything in the letters. Because the letters, investigatively, were close to useless. They were examined exhaustively. Handwriting analysis, psycholinguistics, fingerprints. One partial print that led nowhere at the time. The profile they supported was broad, a loner, probably young, probably local, with paranoid or grandiose thinking. True and useless in the way we have seen before on this channel, a description of thousands of men. Meanwhile, the police response had grown into the largest operation the department had ever mounted. It was called Operation Omega, a task force that grew to some 300 officers, headed by Deputy Inspector Timothy Dowd, working out of Queens. They staked out lovers' lanes. They put officers in parked cars as decoys, night after night, all summer. They checked registered owners of Charter Arms bulldogs across the region, thousands of them. They logged and worked a flood of tips that reached into the tens of thousands, every one of which had to be assessed, because any one of them might be the phone call that named him. And here is the position they were in, which by now will be familiar. The evidence at every scene was bullets and nothing. The letters were theatre. The witnesses had seen a white male of average build, sometimes with dark hair, sometimes described quite differently, descriptions that fit half the young men in the city. The task force was enormous, diligent, and stuck. For the same structural reason the Unabomber task force and the Wichita task force were stuck. A random victim case generates no relationship to trace, and a description without a distinguishing feature is not a filter. It is worth slowing down on the shootings of 1977 because 2 of them broke the pattern, and the breaks mattered to the investigation in ways that are usually skipped. In March 1977, Virginia Voskerichian, a 19-year-old Barnard College student, was shot on a street in Forest Hills, Queens, walking home from the subway in the early evening. Not in a car, not part of a couple, not late at night. She was alone on foot at 7:30. The ballistics matched, so the case joined the series. But consider what that break did to the city's sense of the rule. If the rule was couples in parked cars after midnight, you could stay safe by not being a couple in a parked car after midnight. Voskerichian's death said there was no rule. Anyone, on any street, at any hour of the evening. That is the week the fear stopped being a neighborhood problem and became general. It also gave the police a moment they agonized over for months. A patrol car responding passed a young man on the street near the scene. He said something to the officers. Accounts differ on exactly what, and was gone before the significance registered. Whether that man was the killer has never been established. But the task force believed it might have been, and every detective on Omega carried that near miss around for the rest of the year. The possibility that he had walked past them, spoken to them, and been let go. Then in June 1977, outside a disco called the Eliphas in Bayside, Queens, a young man and woman, Sal Lupo and Judy Placido, were shot in their car after leaving the club. Both survived. Judy Placido, remarkably, had been discussing the son of Sam case inside the disco minutes earlier. That is how completely the fear had saturated ordinary conversation. She was shot 3 times and did not initially realize she had been hit. 2 survivors, more witness fragments, and a new problem. The descriptions did not converge. Some witnesses across the series described a man with dark curly hair. Others, including from the later scenes, described a man with straight or sandy hair, sometimes in a way that suggested a wig, sometimes in a way that suggested a different person entirely. The police released composite sketches that visibly disagreed with each other, and the disagreement itself became a story. Was he wearing disguises? Were the witnesses simply wrong? In the ordinary way, frightened people glimpsing a stranger at night are wrong. Or was there more than one man? Hold that question. It returns at the end of this story because it never fully went away. Meanwhile, understand what Operation Omega was actually doing all those nights, because 300 officers were assigned, is an abstraction. They were sitting in parked cars in couples as bait. Male and female officers, night after night, positioned in the lovers' lanes and disco car parks of Queens and the Bronx, waiting to be attacked. Unmarked units watched the watchers. It was dangerous, tedious work, hundreds of nights of nothing, sustained on the knowledge that any given nothing might end in gunfire, and it never once produced contact with the killer. Whether it displaced him, pushed him toward different boroughs and different circumstances, is unknowable. But the last shooting happened in Brooklyn, where the saturation was thinnest, and displacement is one plausible reading of why. They were also drowning in information, which is its own kind of failure state. The hotline took thousands of calls a week at the peak. Every call generated paper. Wives reported husbands, neighbors reported neighbors, the earnest and the malicious and the unwell all called, and every plausible tip had to be assessed by somebody, because the one call that mattered would look from the outside exactly like the thousands that did not. We have seen this before, Wichita, the Unabomber task force, and it bears repeating because it is so counterintuitive. Past a certain volume, more information makes an investigation slower, not faster. The signal does not rise with the noise. And they were checking gun records. The Bulldog revolver was the one genuinely narrow fact in the whole case, a specific uncommon weapon, and detectives traced registered owners by the thousand across the region. The gun that was eventually recovered had been bought in Texas by a friend of Berkowitz's from his army days and passed to him privately. The one solid investigative thread in the case ran through a purchase in another state that no New York record could reach. That is not incompetence. It is what gun tracing in 1977 was, and the detail is worth knowing because it explains why the strongest lead produced nothing. Now the summer itself, because the shootings were happening inside a city that was coming apart on several fronts at once. The heat arrived early and stayed. On the 13th of July, lightning strikes cascaded the power grid into failure, and the city went dark for a night and a day. And unlike the famously gentle blackout of 1965, this one exploded. Thousands of stores were looted, whole blocks burned, and the sense that the authorities had lost control of the city hardened into something close to certainty. Into that atmosphere, the tabloids ran their countdown to the 29th of July, the anniversary of the first killing, which the Breslin letter had seemed to promise would be marked. The Post and the News were locked in the most cynical circulation war in the city's history, and this case was the ammunition. Rupert Murdoch had bought the Post that year, and its Son of Sam coverage, screaming front pages day after day, became a case study, still taught, in what fear does for circulation. The papers were not covering the panic. They were manufacturing it profitably, with the killer as an unpaid contributor whose letters were the best copy in town. The city, meanwhile, was approaching something close to panic. On the anniversary of the first shooting, the Breslin letter had promised more. And the tabloids counted down, quite literally, toward the 29th of July. Would he mark the anniversary? He missed it by 2 days. The 29th passed with the city holding its breath, decoy cars in every lover's lane in Queens, and nothing. Then, on the 31st, he went somewhere the operation was not. On the 31st of July 1977 in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a borough he had not struck in before, a young man and a young woman were sitting in a parked car near the waterfront on their first date. Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante, both 20, he shot them both. Stacy Moskowitz died. Robert Violante survived with catastrophic injuries, losing most of his sight. That is the last shooting, and we will leave it there, except for one thing. The choice of Brooklyn and of that street is why the case broke. Because this time, the geography betrayed him. The street where he parked, blocks from where he attacked, had a fire hydrant. Now the witness, because the ticket alone might never have surfaced. A woman named Cecilia Davis lived on the street where the Galaxy was parked. Late that night, she was walking her dog, and she noticed things. The kind of small, sequenced observations that make a real witness. She saw police ticketing cars near the hydrant. Shortly afterwards, she passed a young man who looked at her in a way that unsettled her, walking with his arm held oddly, something dark in or near his hand. Minutes later, she heard what she took to be shots. She did not call the police that night or the next day. She was frightened, reasonably so. The killer was famous for shooting people who had seen him, and if he had noticed her, coming forward put her name in the world. It took her 4 days and the urging of friends before she told the police what she had seen. Think about how close that came to not happening. The entire resolution of this case passes through a dog walker deciding, on day 4, to make a phone call she was afraid to make. What she gave the detectives was not a suspect. It was something better, a time and a place with paperwork attached. If the police had been ticketing cars on that street shortly before the shooting, then somewhere in the city's records was a list of every car that had been parked there, with registered owners attached. Understand why that is better than a description. A description is an opinion about a face, formed in the dark, under fear, in seconds. And this case had already demonstrated, in its dueling composite sketches, what such opinions are worth. A parking summons is not an opinion. It is a license plate transcribed by an officer with a pen, standing still, with no reason to be wrong. It converts the question, who was that man, unanswerable, into the question, whose cars were on this street at 11 o'clock, which a clerk can answer from a drawer. Even so, the ticket lead was nearly lost in the shuffle, and honesty about the record requires saying so. In the first days after Bensonhurst, the task force was working other, more glamorous leads, including a lengthy pursuit of a different local man that consumed serious resources. The summons check was one line of inquiry among many, and not the favored one. Retrieving the physical tickets from the system took days and more than one request. The mundane lead had to survive the competition of the exciting ones, and it very nearly didn't. That, too, is a pattern worth naming. In the moment, before you know the answer, the boring lead always looks like the one that can wait. Detectives pulled the summonses issued in that area that night. There were only a few. Most checked out immediately, local residents, ordinary explanations. One was a cream Ford Galaxy registered to a David Berkowitz of Pine Street, Yonkers. Yonkers is not Brooklyn. It is a separate city north of the Bronx, a long drive from Bensonhurst. There was no innocent reason anybody could think of for that car to have been on that street at that hour. And its owner, when detectives began asking around, turned out to be already known to police in his own neighborhood, for reasons that had nothing officially to do with the case. Because in Yonkers, strange things had been happening for a year, and they had a paper trail of their own. A family called the Carr family, who lived behind Berkowitz's building on Pine Street, had been receiving anonymous letters, disturbing, escalating letters complaining about their black Labrador. The dog had subsequently been shot. A neighbor had received bizarre anonymous notes. There had been unexplained fires in the neighborhood, and someone had been keeping what later turned out to be a diary of them. Local police had looked at the odd young postal worker at 35 Pine Street in connection with some of it. The Carr family's name was Sam. Sam Carr, the owner of the dog. Son of Sam. When the Brooklyn detectives and the Yonkers officers compared notes, the hair on their arms must have stood up. The task force had spent a year sifting the entire city. The answer had been sitting in a neighbor dispute file in Yonkers, attached to a man whose car had just been ticketed at a murder scene. On the 10th of August 1977, detectives went to Pine Street and found the Galaxy parked outside. Through its window they could see a duffel bag with a rifle butt protruding and a letter in block capitals in the style they knew very well. They staked the car out and waited. When Berkowitz came out and got in, a detective put a gun to the window. And the account of what he said next has been told the same way by the officers ever since. He smiled and said, "You got me." He said it almost with relief. In the car was the .44 caliber Bulldog. The arrest itself deserves the fuller telling. because the ordinariness of it is the point. The detectives who went to Pine Street on the 10th of August were not certain they had their man. A ticketed car at a distance from a crime scene is a lead, not a case, and the plan for the evening was cautious. Locate the vehicle, assess, perhaps interview the owner as a possible witness. It was the sight of the rifle butt and the block capital letter through the car window that changed the operation from an inquiry into an arrest, because the letter, visible on the seat, was written in a hand that half the detectives in New York could recognize on sight by that summer. Even then they waited, hours watching the car while the machinery assembled, because the one thing nobody wanted was the correct suspect and a procedural error. When Berkowitz finally emerged carrying a paper bag and got into the Galaxy, Detective John Falotico came up on the window. The man inside turned and smiled at him. "You know me," the accounts have him saying in one version or another, and then, "I'm Sam. You got me." There was no resistance of any kind. The bulldog was in the paper bag beside him. Inside his apartment, officers found walls covered in scrawled writing and material connecting him to the letters and the scenes. The apartment of the most hunted man in America was a small, squalid room in Yonkers with holes in the plaster and slogans on the walls, and the overwhelming impression the officers took from it was not menace. It was shabbiness. His confession that night ran for hours and was, by the account of everyone in the room, calm, detailed, and almost eager. He confessed to shootings the police asked about and corrected details they had wrong. Whatever else was uncertain in the years that followed, the men who sat across the table that night came away without doubt that he had been present at the scenes he described. David Berkowitz was 24 years old, a postal employee, a former army soldier adopted as a baby by a couple from the Bronx, described by neighbors and co-workers in the terms you will now find wearily familiar from this channel: quiet, polite, kept to himself, no trouble. His biography, once assembled, was a study in accumulating isolation. His adoptive mother, to whom he was close, died when he was 14, and people who knew him marked that as the hinge. He served in the army, including a posting in Korea, and came back more solitary than he went. He located his birth mother in adulthood, a reunion that, by his own later account, unsettled rather than healed, because the story he had been told about his origins turned out not to be true. He worked sorting mail. He had no close friends, no relationships, and a growing file of strange behavior that only became legible as a pattern after the 10th of August. The anonymous letters, the fires, the shot dog. None of that explains anything, and we should be careful with it. Cities are full of isolated young men with sad histories who harm no one. The biography is not a mechanism. It is simply what was there when people finally looked, and the fact that nobody had looked is itself the recurring lesson of these cases. He was not hiding. He was unnoticed, which is different and easier and available to anyone whose life has arranged itself so that no one is paying attention. He confessed the same night at length and in detail, details that matched the scenes. And he told the detectives the story that became the case's myth, that Sam Carr's black Labrador was possessed by an ancient demon and that the dog had transmitted commands to kill. That story requires care, because what happened to it afterwards matters. At the time, it fed a legal question. Was this man insane? Psychiatrists disagreed. He was ultimately found competent to stand trial, and in May 1978, he pleaded guilty to all 6 murders and was sentenced to consecutive terms totaling more than 300 years. There was no trial, and therefore no full public testing of the evidence, a fact that left room for everything that came later. And then, in 1979, Berkowitz himself told psychiatrists that the demon dog story had been an invention, a fabrication he had constructed, he said, in the hope of an insanity defense. The most famous detail of the case, the one in every headline, was by its own author's account a lie told to the men questioning him. Take the caution from that. The theatrical detail, the demon, the letters, the name, was the part the world remembered, and it was the least reliable part of the record. The parking ticket was the truest thing in the case, and nobody put it in a headline. Now the part that is genuinely contested, because this case has one, and honesty requires setting it out, rather than pretending the record is tidy. Berkowitz pleaded guilty to all the shootings, and the physical evidence, the gun above all, supported it. The official position of the NYPD was and remains that he acted alone. But questions were raised almost immediately and never entirely settled. Witness descriptions across the shootings varied more than one shooter should produce, different builds, different hair. A journalist named Maury Terry spent years arguing that Berkowitz had not acted alone but as part of a group, and pointed at, among others, the sons of Sam Carr, John and Michael Carr, both of whom died young in strange circumstances within a few years of the arrest. And Berkowitz himself from prison in later years said the shootings had involved a cult and that he had not pulled the trigger in every attack, while refusing to elaborate in any way that could be tested. The Yonkers authorities briefly reopened an inquiry in the 1990s. Nothing came of it that changed the official account. What should you make of that? Here is the fair summary. The convicted man is a confessed serial fabricator whose most famous claim was, by his own admission, a lie, which cuts both ways because it undermines his lone gunman confession and his cult claims equally. The conspiracy case rests substantially on witness variation, which is real, and on the strangeness around the Carr brothers, which is also real, and neither of which is proof. No physical evidence has ever placed a second shooter at any scene. It is not settled in the way people want it to be, and this channel is not going to pretend otherwise. What is settled is who owned the gun, whose car was ticketed, and who said "you got me." There is a legal postscript, and it is the case's most concrete legacy. Within months of the arrest, publishers were reported to be offering large sums for Berkowitz's story. The idea that the man who had terrorized the city might become wealthy narrating it produced genuine public revulsion, and the New York legislature passed a statute in 1977 requiring that money earned by criminals from selling their stories be held for the benefit of their victims. It was called, and is still called, the Son of Sam law. In 1991, the Supreme Court struck down New York's version as a violation of the First Amendment. The ruling arose from a case involving a different criminal's memoir, and the state rewrote it more narrowly. Versions of it exist across America to this day. It is a strange kind of memorial. The case's most enduring legal product exists specifically to prevent the man at the center of it from profiting, because everyone understood, even in 1977, that he would try to convert his notoriety into an income. The audience seeking that ran through the letters was correctly diagnosed by the legislature within weeks. Berkowitz remains in prison. He has been denied parole repeatedly, and for decades now has described himself as a born-again Christian who calls himself the Son of Hope. He has said he does not seek release, and at his parole hearings he has said in substance that he deserves to stay where he is. Whether that transformation is genuine is not something this channel can adjudicate, and it does not much matter for our purposes. What is worth noticing is the continuity. The man who named himself Son of Sam renamed himself Son of Hope. The instinct to be a named character in a story about himself did not go away. It changed genre. And the people the story actually happened to deserve the last word before the lessons, because their aftermath is the part the retellings skip. Robert Violante, who survived Bensonhurst, lost one eye entirely and most of the vision in the other at 20 on a first date. He rebuilt a life around that fact and spent it, in his public statements, opposing every parole application, patiently, decade after decade. The survivors of the other shootings carried bullets, paralysis, and grief through the same decades, mostly without microphones. Stacy Moskowitz's mother, Nasa, became for 30 years the case's most unrelenting public voice, attending hearings, giving interviews, refusing to allow the file to close emotionally, even though it had closed legally. In a strange late chapter, she corresponded with Berkowitz himself before her death, an exchange she described in terms that resist simple summary, which is often what the aftermath of these cases actually looks like. Not resolution, but people managing an unresolvable thing for the rest of their lives. The detectives, too, carried it. Timothy Dowd, who led Omega, was asked for the rest of his career about the case that made his name, and gave the same honest answer in different forms: that the work mattered, that the system functioned, and that the break, when it came from a parking ticket. Falotico and his partner spent decades gently correcting the record about who said what at the arrest. The one thing every one of them agreed on was the one thing the mythology never absorbed, that the ending was ordinary, procedural, and small. And the Carr brothers, since we raised them, should be accounted for honestly. John Carr died in 1978 in North Dakota of a shotgun wound recorded as suicide. Michael Carr died in 1979 when his car hit a streetlight on the West Side Highway. 2 young deaths in 2 years in the immediate orbit of the case is exactly the kind of pattern that keeps a conspiracy alive for half a century. And it is also, in a country of accidents and suicides, exactly the kind of pattern that coincidence produces all the time. Both statements are true. That is why the question has never fully closed, and why this video reports it as open rather than resolving it by preference. One more strand belongs in the record before the lessons, because it shaped everything that came after in American policing. The Son of Sam investigation was, by the standards of its time, technologically primitive in a way that shocked even its own participants. Tips were on paper, summonses were on paper, gun registrations were on paper, filed by state, unsearchable across lines. The connection between a ticketed car in Brooklyn and a strange young man in a Yonkers neighbor dispute file existed for days before any human being was in a position to see both facts at once, because the facts lived in different drawers, in different cities, in systems that could not speak to each other. The case became one of the standard arguments in the decades that followed for the computerization of police records, for the databases that would later make cases searchable across jurisdictions. Whether those systems would have caught him faster is unknowable. What is certain is that the case was solved at the exact moment 2 pieces of paper from 2 different filing systems landed on the same desk, and that it took a year, a witness, and a dead dog to make that happen. So what does this case actually teach? 4 things. The first is the one the whole video has been building to. The largest manhunt in NYPD history was ended by a parking summons. Not by the 300 officers, though their work narrowed the ground. Not by the profile, which described half the city. Not by the letters, which were theater. By a hydrant, a ticket, and a clerk's ability to retrieve it, the most boring apparatus the city possessed. There is a lesson in that which recurs across every case this channel has covered. The Unabomber fell to prose style. BTK fell to file metadata. Berkowitz fell to parking enforcement. The instrument of capture is almost never the glamorous one, because the glamorous evidence, the letters, the taunts, the performance, is the part the offender controls and curates. The mundane paper trail is the part nobody thinks to control, because nobody thinks of it at all. He wore no gloves against the parking ticket. There was no way to. The city writes down where cars are, and he had a car. The second is about the witness. Cecilia Davis was frightened, and she came forward anyway, 4 days late and in spite of it, and everything followed from that. Every task force in the world runs on the willingness of ordinary scared people to make a phone call that costs them something. The reward, the largest in the city's history, played no part. She did not come forward for money. She came forward because her friends told her it mattered, and she believed them. The third is about the media machine. The son of Sam Summer built the modern template of the celebrity killer. The name, the letters, the front pages, the circulation war. And it is worth saying plainly that the audience was part of the crime. He wrote to be read, the city read, the papers sold 1 million copies on his words. The son of Sam Law exists because the legislature understood, correctly, that the notoriety itself was the thing he had been purchasing with other people's lives, and moved within weeks to make it worthless. That is the deepest continuity with the other cases we have covered. Zodiac wanted an audience. The Unabomber demanded publication. BTK could not stay silent. Berkowitz signed his work. The need to be known is the most reliable weakness in this kind of offender. It is what generates the letters and the names. And it is also precisely what the modern true crime industry, this channel included, has to handle with care, because attention was what he wanted, and attention is what retellings provide. It is why this video has spent its time on the ticket, the witness, and the clerks, and not on him. And the fourth is the quietest. 6 people were killed and 7 maimed by a man whose entire mythology demons, commands, a talking dog, was, on his own later account, invented. Strip the myth away, and what remains is unbearably ordinary. A resentful, isolated young man with a revolver, shooting strangers, mostly women, in parked cars. The mythology made him a monster, which made him interesting. The record makes him small, which is worse and true. The city was terrorized for a year by someone its own filing system had already recorded. It just took a hydrant, a dog walker, and 4 days of a frightened woman's courage for anyone to look. The letters are in evidence storage. The bulldog is in evidence storage. The parking ticket, the actual piece of paper that ended it, passed back into the administrative machinery it came from, uncelebrated, like the millions of others written that year. Which is, when you think about it, exactly right. It was never special. That was the whole point. The city had been recording the truth all along, one license plate at a time, waiting for somebody to have a reason to read it. Sources and method. This account draws on the NYPD record of the Omega Task Force and the arrest, the New York court record of the guilty plea and sentencing, the published texts of the Borelli and Breslin letters, contemporaneous reporting from the New York Daily News, the New York Times, and other outlets across 1976 and 1977, the 1979 psychiatric accounts in which Berkowitz recanted the demon story, the Supreme Court's 1991 ruling on the son of Sam Law, and the published claims and counterclaims concerning accomplices, including the investigative work of Maury Terry and the responses of the NYPD. Where the record is genuinely contested, above all, whether Berkowitz acted entirely alone, this video sets out the competing positions and the limits of the evidence rather than choosing the tidier story. Details of the attacks themselves have been kept to the minimum needed to follow the investigation. The people he killed and wounded are not material for a story about a parking ticket, and this account does not treat them as such. On the 14th of December 1991, a man in Phoenix, Arizona, was asked to bite into a piece of styrofoam. He was 35 years old. He had served 6 years in the United States Air Force and 7 more delivering mail for the Postal Service, and he had no criminal record of any kind. He was cooperative. When the detectives asked him to come in, he came in. When they asked him questions, he answered them. And when they produced a slab of white polystyrene and asked him to close his teeth on it, he did that too, without a lawyer present, because he could not imagine what harm it could possibly do. That piece of styrofoam would cost him 10 years of his life. His name was Ray Crone, and the impression of his teeth in that foam would become the entire case against him. Not a fingerprint. Not a witness, not a confession, not a single thread of his clothing, not a hair, not a drop of blood. The state of Arizona would try him twice, convict him twice, and sentence him to death on the strength of the shape of his mouth. He had crooked teeth. That was the whole of it. This is the story of how a science that looked like science, that was taught in universities, testified to under oath, and accepted by courts across America for decades, put an innocent man on death row and left a guilty one free to hurt someone else. It is the story of the 10 years it took to undo. And when the truth finally arrived, it did not come from a detective or a judge or a re-examination of the evidence. It came from a machine comparing one string of letters to another in a database that had not existed when Ray Crone was arrested. And it is the story of where the real killer had been, all that time, while a postal worker sat in a cell waiting to be executed for what he had done. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what the police were looking at on the morning of the 29th of December, 1991, and how little they had. A woman named Kim Ancona had been killed overnight in a bar called the CBS Lounge on East Camelback Road in Phoenix. She was 36. She worked there as a bartender, and she had been closing up alone. Whoever killed her had left almost nothing behind. There were no useful fingerprints. There was no murder weapon recovered at the scene. There was no sign of forced entry, which suggested she had either known the person or let them in after hours. And there were no witnesses, because at that hour there was nobody left in the building to witness anything. The first days of an investigation like that are a particular kind of pressure. A bar is one of the worst possible crime scenes. Hundreds of people pass through it in a week. Every surface has been touched by dozens of hands, and the physical traces of any one of them are buried under the traces of all the others. Detectives working the CBS lounge were not short of material. They were drowning in it, and almost none of it meant anything. What there was on her body was a set of marks. The medical examiner recorded them as bite marks. There were two, one on the left breast, one on the neck. In a case with no fingerprints, no weapon, and no witness, those marks were the only thing that might be said to carry a signature. And in 1991, in Phoenix, Arizona, a bite mark was considered to be exactly that. So the question became simple: who had teeth that matched? Before we go further, you need to know why the detectives in that room believed a bite mark could answer that question at all. Because they were not being reckless. They were applying what the American legal system had spent nearly 2 decades telling them was true. The technique had entered American courts properly in 1975 in a California case called People versus Marks. An elderly woman had been killed and there were bite marks on her nose. 3 dental experts compared them to a suspect's teeth using dental models and photographic overlays. The court admitted the testimony, and the conviction was upheld on appeal. The appellate ruling was cautious. It noted the unusual clarity of these particular marks, but the door was open, and precedent works the way precedent works. Once one court has admitted a technique, the next court is no longer evaluating a novel claim. It is following authority. And then, 4 years later, bite mark evidence got something no forensic discipline can buy: a famous conviction. In 1979, in Florida, Ted Bundy was tried for the murders at the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee. The physical evidence against him was thin. What the prosecution had was a bite mark on one of the victims, and Bundy's teeth, which were crooked and chipped in a distinctive way. A forensic odontologist named Richard Suverin testified that the marks matched. The jury convicted, and Bundy was sentenced to death. That case did more for bite mark analysis than any study could have. It put the discipline on the front page of every newspaper in the country, attached to the most notorious criminal of the era, in a trial that ended in conviction. It established forensic odontology in the public mind and in the professional one as a technique that caught monsters. Prosecutors saw a tool that worked. Dentists saw a career path. Juries saw a science that had helped convict Ted Bundy and reasoned, sensibly and wrongly, that it must therefore be sound. Nothing about the Bundy verdict demonstrated that bite marks could reliably identify a person. It demonstrated that a jury would convict on them. Those are entirely different propositions, and for the next 20 years, almost nobody in the system distinguished between the two. By 1991, the American Board of Forensic Odontology had been certifying practitioners for 15 years. There were conferences, credentials, and expert witnesses available in every state. When the Phoenix detectives looked at the marks on Kim Ancona's body, they were not reaching for something experimental. They were reaching for an established tool. A friend of Kim Ancona's told police that she had mentioned a man named Ray who was going to help her close the bar that night. Crone was a regular. He played on the bar's darts team. He knew her the way a regular knows a bartender. Well enough to be named, not well enough to be close. He was, by his own account and everybody else's, one of perhaps dozens of people who drank in that bar and knew Kim Ancona by name. But he was the Ray who had been mentioned. And when the police brought him in and looked at him, they saw something that must have felt like providence. Ray Crone's front teeth were noticeably crooked. The upper incisors were rotated and misaligned, one pushed forward over the other in a way that was immediately visible when he spoke. It was the kind of dental irregularity a person notices about themselves in photographs and stops thinking about by the time they are 20. It was also, in the logic of forensic odontology, as it was practiced in 1991, a signature, a unique and identifiable pattern that would leave a unique and identifiable mark. They asked him to bite the styrofoam. He bit it. He was arrested and charged with murder within days. And from that point on, the state of Arizona had a theory, and everything that followed was built on it. Here is what you need to understand about bite mark analysis, because it is the thing that makes this case matter beyond one man's misfortune. It was never tested, not in the way you would assume. The premises seemed reasonable, and that was the problem. They seemed so reasonable that nobody insisted on checking them. The first premise was that human dentition is unique, like a fingerprint. that no two people in the world have exactly the same arrangement of teeth. The second was that this uniqueness transfers faithfully to skin, that when teeth close on a human body, they leave a mark preserving that individuality accurately enough to identify one person and exclude everyone else. Both of those premises were assumed. Neither had been established by the kind of study that would be required of a new drug or a new engineering material or any claim in a working laboratory science. There was no known error rate. There was no database of dental patterns against which uniqueness could be measured. There was no standard method that different examiners were required to follow, and no test of whether two qualified examiners looking at the same mark would even reach the same conclusion. And the second premise, in particular, was worse than untested. It was working against physics. Skin is not a recording medium. It is elastic. It moves, it swells, it bruises, and it changes over hours and days. A mark made on a living body is distorted by the body's own response to being marked. A mark on a body that has been moved or that has lain in one position for hours distorts further. The tissue that receives a bite is not a fixed surface like wax or clay. It is close to the least reliable substrate you could choose for recording a fine pattern. There is a further problem, and it is the one that would eventually prove fatal to the whole discipline. Bite mark analysis was not conducted blind. The examiner was typically given the mark and the suspect's dental impression together, already knowing that the police believed this person had done it. They were not asked an open question, whose teeth made this mark? They were asked a closed one. Could these teeth have made this mark? And a closed question asked of an ambiguous pattern by someone who already knows the answer the asker is hoping for has a strong tendency to come back yes. None of this was hidden. It was simply not asked. What existed instead was a professional community with credentials, conferences, a certification process, and a body of experts who testified in criminal trials across the country. It had the apparatus of a science. It had the vocabulary of a science. What it did not have was evidence that the thing it claimed to do could actually be done. And juries, being reasonable people, heard a credentialed expert say that the marks on a murdered woman's body matched the defendant's teeth, and they did what reasonable people do. They believed it. Ray Crone's first trial began in August 1992. The prosecution's case had a hole in the middle of it that would be obvious to anyone reading the file today. There was no physical evidence connecting Crone to the crime scene beyond the bite marks. Blood was found at the scene that did not belong to Kim Ancona and did not belong to Ray Crone either. Hair recovered from the scene did not match him. A palm print did not match him. He said he had been at home, asleep, and there was nothing to place him at the bar that night beyond a friend's recollection that Kim had mentioned a man named Ray. Against that, the state had a videotape. The prosecution's expert, a dentist named Raymond Rawson, had prepared a video presentation demonstrating how Crone's dental impression overlaid the marks on the victim's body. It was shown to the jury. It was persuasive in the way visual demonstrations are persuasive. It took an abstract claim and made it look like a physical fit, a key going into a lock. Rawson testified that the marks matched Crone's teeth. There was also a problem with the tape that would matter enormously later. The defense had been given almost no time to review it before trial. Their own expert had not had the opportunity to examine it properly. In a case where a single piece of evidence carried the entire prosecution, the defense went into court without having been able to test the only thing that mattered. The jury convicted him. He was sentenced to death. The press at the time gave him a nickname. They called him the Snaggletooth Killer. It was printed in newspapers. It followed him. A man was going to be executed, and the thing the public knew him by was the shape of his teeth. He went to death row at Arizona State Prison and began the process of appeal, which in a capital case is slow, expensive, and almost always futile. It is worth being clear about what an appeal can and cannot do, because most people assume it is a second look at whether the defendant did it. It is not. An appeal examines whether the trial was conducted correctly, whether evidence was properly admitted, whether the judge instructed the jury correctly, whether procedure was followed. It does not reweigh the facts. An appellate court reading Ray Crone's file was not asking whether the bite marks really matched. It was asking whether the trial court had been entitled to let a jury hear a qualified expert say that they did. And under the law as it stood, it plainly had been. That distinction is the trapdoor underneath every conviction built on bad forensic science. If the science is admitted correctly and the expert is credentialed and the procedure is followed, then the appeal has nothing to bite on. The system's error correction machinery is designed to catch procedural failures, and this was not a procedural failure. Everybody followed the rules. The rules permitted a technique that did not work. But in 1995, something unusual happened. The Arizona Supreme Court overturned his conviction. They did not do it because they doubted the bite mark evidence. They did it on a procedural point. The state had failed to disclose that videotape to the defense in time, and that failure had deprived Crone of a fair opportunity to challenge the central evidence against him. It was a narrow ruling about disclosure, not a judgment about the science, which meant the state got to try him again, and the science got to walk back into the courtroom untouched. The second trial in 1996 went worse. By now, the defense had experts of their own prepared to say that the bite mark identification was unsound. They put on that case. It did not work. The problem was structural, and it is worth being precise about it, because it explains why bad forensic science is so extraordinarily difficult to dislodge once it has been admitted. When a defense expert stands up and says the state's analysis is wrong, a jury does not hear a scientific claim being refuted. It hears two experts disagreeing. And when two experts disagree, a jury falls back on the things it can actually assess. Which one seemed more confident? Which one seemed more credentialed? Which one was hired by the side that appears to be making excuses? The state's expert is presented as neutral, an officer of the system. The defense's expert has been paid by the accused. The asymmetry is invisible in the transcript and decisive in the jury room. He was convicted a second time. This time the judge did something that turned out to matter. He sentenced Crone not to death, but to life imprisonment. And in doing so, he said on the record that he had reservations. He stated that he was not entirely convinced of Crone's guilt, and that the doubt was sufficient that he was unwilling to impose a death sentence. Read that again, because it is one of the strangest sentences in American criminal justice. A judge said in open court that he was not sure the man in front of him had done it, and then sent him to prison for the rest of his life anyway, because within the rules as they stood, that was the outcome the verdict required. Ray Crone went back to prison. He had now been convicted twice by two juries on the same evidence. In the ordinary run of things, that is the end. Two convictions is the point at which the system considers the matter closed, and the appeals become a formality that runs out. It is worth pausing on what those years actually were, because the phrase 10 years in prison passes very quickly in a sentence and did not pass quickly for him. He spent the first stretch on death row, which in practice means near total isolation. A cell, meals through a slot, limited time outside it, and the specific psychological weight of a scheduled ending. He was a man with no criminal history at all, an Air Force veteran, a postal worker with a clean record, dropped into the most restrictive environment the state operates. He maintained throughout that he had not done it. Prisoners who maintain innocence are, as a rule, treated worse by the system than those who express remorse, because remorse is what parole boards and programs are built to reward. Refusing to confess to something you did not do carries a price, and it is paid in years. His family kept working. That is the unglamorous engine underneath most exonerations. Somebody on the outside who does not stop. They spent money they did not have on lawyers and experts. His parents remortgaged. A cousin campaigned. None of it produced a breakthrough for a decade. What saved him, in the end, was not a lawyer or a judge or a re-examination of the bite marks. What saved him was that somebody had kept the evidence. Throughout both trials, biological material recovered from the scene and from Kim Ancona's clothing had sat in storage. It had been tested using the methods available in 1991 and 1992, and those methods had not been sensitive enough to produce anything conclusive. The samples were small. The technology of the early 90s needed a relatively large, relatively clean sample to produce a usable profile. But the samples had not been destroyed. They had been preserved, catalogued, and left in an evidence locker, and they sat there through the first trial, through the appeal, through the second trial, and through the years afterwards. And while they sat there, the technology changed underneath them. Through the 1990s, DNA analysis moved from a technique that needed a substantial sample to one that could work from traces, from a few cells, from material that a decade earlier would have been dismissed as insufficient. What had been untestable in 1992 was routine by 2001. In 2002, Crohn's legal team secured an order for the preserved samples to be retested using current methods. The results came back that April. DNA from saliva on the victim's clothing and from other material recovered at the scene produced a clear profile. It was not Ray Crohn's. That result did two things at once, and it is worth separating them, because they are not the same thing, and the second is what makes this case extraordinary. The first is that it excluded him. The DNA proved that the biological material left by the person who killed Kim Ancona did not come from Ray Crohn. After 10 years, 3 months, and 8 days in prison, much of it under sentence of death, he was exonerated and released. He walked out in April 2002 as the 100th person in the United States to be exonerated from death row since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. The 100th, not the first, not an aberration, the 100th. The second thing the DNA did was answer the question the bite marks had been brought in to answer. Because by 2002, there was a national database. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, had been collecting profiles from convicted offenders across the United States since the mid-1990s. The profile recovered from Kim Ancona's clothing was run against it. It matched a man named Kenneth Phillips. Phillips had been living, at the time of the murder, roughly 600 yards from the CBS lounge. He had no connection to Ray Crohn. He had not been a suspect. He had never been interviewed because the investigation had found its man in the first week and stopped looking. And here is the part that sits worst. Kenneth Phillips was already in the custody of the state of Arizona. He was serving a sentence for a violent assault committed a matter of weeks after Kim Ancona was killed, in the period when the police had already arrested Ray Crohn and considered the case closed. The man whose teeth did not match had spent 10 years in prison. The man whose DNA did match had been inside the same prison system for most of it, convicted of a crime he committed while an innocent man was being processed for his. Phillips was subsequently convicted of Kim Ancona's murder. Stay with that sequence for a moment, because it contains the part of this story that usually gets lost. A wrongful conviction is normally discussed as a harm to the person convicted, and it plainly is. But it is not only that. Every wrongful conviction has a second half, and the second half is that the investigation stops. The file closes. The detectives move to other work. Whoever actually did it walks out of the frame entirely, not because they were clever, but because the system has stopped looking for them and formally announced that it has found them already. In this case, the timeline is unusually stark. Kim Ancona was killed in late December 1991. Ray Crohn was arrested within days. And within weeks of that arrest, with the case considered solved, with the police no longer searching, with the entire apparatus of the Phoenix investigation now pointed at building a prosecution against a postal worker, the man who had actually killed her committed a violent assault on somebody else. That is not hindsight, it is arithmetic. There was a window in which the real perpetrator was at liberty and unexamined, and the reason the window existed was that the wrong man had already been arrested. So the bite mark evidence did not simply take 10 years from Ray Crohn. It closed a live murder investigation on a false answer, and it did so quickly enough that the consequences fell on a real person who did not have to be harmed. Kim Ancona's case was not solved in 1992. It was only declared solved. The difference between those two things had a cost, and somebody else paid part of it. Ray Crohn came out in 2002 at the age of 45. He had gone in at 35. He received compensation from the state and the city. The figure eventually reported was around $1.4 million, a little under $140,000 for each year taken. He has spent the years since speaking publicly about wrongful conviction and about the science that produced his. Because the science did not quietly retire after this. That is the thing worth staying with. Ray Crone was not the only one, and his case was not the worst. Consider what else was sitting in American prisons while the discipline continued to operate. In Mississippi, 2 men from the same small county were convicted in separate cases in the early 1990s, each on bite mark testimony from the same forensic dentist. Levon Brooks was convicted in 1992 and given life. Kennedy Brewer was convicted in 1995 and sentenced to death. The marks on the victims were identified as human bites and matched to each man's teeth. Both convictions stood for years. Both were eventually overturned by DNA, and when the DNA was run, it identified a single man who had committed both crimes, someone who had been a suspect early on and was not pursued. 2 innocent men, 30-plus combined years, 1 actual perpetrator free the entire time, and in at least one instance, a serious question about whether the marks were bites at all, rather than damage from insects and small animals. In Virginia, a sailor named Keith Harwood was convicted in 1982 after 6 dental experts testified that his teeth matched marks on a victim. He served 33 years. DNA cleared him in 2016 and identified another man who had died in prison in 2006 while Harwood was still serving. In Texas, Stephen Mark Cheney was convicted in 1987 on testimony that the odds of the bite mark coming from someone other than him were 1 in a million. That statistic had no basis whatsoever. There was no data set from which such a figure could be calculated. He served 28 years. Read those together, and a pattern emerges that is not about individual error. The same technique, in different states, with different examiners, produced the same result: confident identification of the wrong man, surviving trial, surviving appeal, and undone only by a biological test that had nothing to do with teeth. It took until 2009 for the National Academy of Sciences to publish a landmark report examining forensic science in the United States, which found insufficient scientific basis to conclude that bite marks could reliably identify an individual. It took until 2016 for the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology to review the discipline again and conclude that it did not meet the standards of a valid method, and to note that examiners could not reliably agree even on whether a given mark was a human bite at all. 25 years after Ray Crone bit into a piece of styrofoam in a Phoenix police station, the highest scientific advisory bodies in the country were still writing reports explaining that the thing which convicted him had never worked. And almost nothing happened to the people who provided the testimony. Expert witnesses are generally immune from civil liability for what they say on the stand. Professional bodies police their own members, and a body whose existence depends on the legitimacy of a technique has limited appetite for concluding that the technique is worthless. Some practitioners faced professional consequences, most did not. The men who went to prison were released, in the cases where they were released at all, and the structure that put them there remained standing. You would assume that after 2 national scientific reviews reached that conclusion, the technique would simply have been withdrawn. It was not, and the reason is worth understanding, because it is the same reason it took so long to expose. Courts do not work like laboratories. A laboratory abandons a method when the evidence against it becomes strong enough. A court asks a narrower question: is this the kind of evidence that judges in this jurisdiction have previously allowed juries to hear? And by 2009, the answer had been yes for 34 years, in state after state, in hundreds of cases. The weight of precedent was enormous, and precedent does not care what the National Academy of Sciences has published. Every judge who admitted bite mark testimony after 2009 could point to a long line of judges who had admitted it before. There was movement. In 2016, the Texas Forensic Science Commission, which had been examining the Cheney case, recommended that bite mark comparison should not be admitted in Texas courtrooms without demonstrated scientific validity, the first body of its kind in America to take that step. Some appellate courts elsewhere began to treat the testimony more skeptically. A number of practitioners left the field. But there was no national moment of withdrawal, no order that vacated the convictions built on it. What happened instead is what usually happens. The technique faded slowly at the front end, becoming harder to introduce in new trials, while the people already convicted on it stayed exactly where they were. A discredited method does not release anybody. Somebody has to bring each case back, one at a time, with lawyers and funding and preserved evidence and a court willing to look again. And most of those cases have no preserved evidence at all, because in the great majority of crimes, there is nothing biological to retest. That is the quiet arithmetic underneath every exoneration you have ever read about. Ray Crone got out because his case happened to have a saliva sample. The men whose cases did not are still serving. There is a way of telling this story that makes it about a mistake, and that telling is comfortable and wrong. A mistake is a fingerprint misread, a witness who saw badly, a lab result mixed up. Those things happen, and systems are built to catch them. This was not that. The bite mark evidence in Ray Crone's case was not misapplied. It was applied exactly as the discipline intended, by a certified practitioner using accepted methods, and it produced a confident identification of an innocent man. The technique worked as designed. The design was the problem. And the mechanism that eventually corrected it was not the courts, and not the profession, and not any process of scientific self-examination. 2 juries heard the evidence and believed it. 2 trials tested it under adversarial conditions, and it survived both. A judge who doubted the verdict imposed it anyway. The correction came from outside, from a preserved sample, a technology that improved while the case sat still, and a database that did not exist when the case began. Ray Crone was not freed because the system realized it was wrong. He was freed because somebody, years earlier, had put a swab in an envelope and not thrown it away. That is a thin thread to hang a man's life on. And it is worth asking, as the cases built the same way continue to be reviewed one at a time, how many other envelopes were never kept?